The notice was printed on bright orange paper, the kind county governments use when they want to make sure nobody ignores something before they take it. Clara Weston almost walked past it. She had come into the laundromat on the corner of 5th and Maple to use the bathroom, because the gas station 2 blocks down had a broken lock and the library didn't open until 9, and it was only 7:45 on a Wednesday morning in late October, and her daughter Lily was asleep across the back seat of the car with a balled-up winter coat under her cheek. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Clara was 39 years old. She had been sleeping in that car for 11 days. She would have kept walking if the words tax auction hadn't appeared in bold black letters at the top of the notice, and if the number printed beneath the property description hadn't stopped her cold. The asking price was listed as $300. Not $3,000. Not $30,000. $300 for a residential structure and the land surrounding it, located at rural Route 7, outside the town of Calder Falls, Missouri. A farmhouse, abandoned for decades, owing back taxes so far beyond recovery that the county had simply decided to let it go for whatever the morning could produce. Clara stood in front of that board for a long time, long enough that the woman sorting whites 2 machines down glanced over twice. She read the description again. Structural integrity unknown. No utilities. Access road unpaved and subject to seasonal conditions. Previous owner deceased. No surviving heirs identified. Property sold as is. No warranty expressed or implied. Every phrase was designed to scare people away. It worked, probably, on most of them. Clara pulled out the phone she was 3 weeks behind on paying and took a photograph of the notice. She had not always lived this way. There was a version of her life, not so far back that she couldn't still feel its edges, where she'd had a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, a steady job as a billing coordinator for a regional medical group, and a husband named Derek who coached youth soccer on weekends and made pancakes every Sunday morning without being asked. That version ended the way a lot of versions end, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a long, slow erosion that she kept expecting to reverse until the day she understood it wouldn't. Derek left when Lily was 4. He didn't leave violently or even dramatically. He left the way water disappears from a bowl left on a windowsill, a little at a time, then all at once. He had been unhappy for years, he said. He needed to find out who he was outside of responsibility. Clara would later reflect that she had spent an enormous amount of energy being angry at the particular self-centeredness of that phrasing, as if the child they had made together was merely an obstacle to his self-discovery rather than a person who would carry his absence in her body for the rest of her life. The divorce cost her $11,000 in legal fees and half of what was in their joint savings account, which by the time everything finalized amounted to $4,200 split 2 ways. She kept the apartment because Lily's school was nearby. She kept the job because she had no other option. For a while, she kept her balance, grocery shopping on a schedule, tracking every expense in a notebook she carried in her purse, allowing herself one small indulgence per week, usually a cup of coffee from the place on the corner that used real cream. Then the medical group was absorbed by a larger network, and the larger network outsourced its billing department to a company in Georgia, and Clara received her notice on a Thursday afternoon with 60 days of severance and a form letter thanking her for her years of service. She filed for unemployment the same day. She started applying for jobs the morning after. For 3 months, she sent out applications with the diligence of someone who still believed that effort produced results in proportion to its sincerity. Some applications went unanswered. Some produced interviews that produced silence. One produced a callback and then a verbal offer that was rescinded 2 days later when the company announced a hiring freeze. She reduced expenses everywhere she could reduce them. She stopped buying coffee. She moved Lily to the less expensive after-school program. She switched to generic everything. She sold the furniture she didn't strictly need and the clothes she hadn't worn in more than a year and a keyboard she had once bought with the intention of learning to play it. None of it was enough. The eviction notice arrived on a Friday in September. She had 30 days. Her mother, when Clara called her, said she wished she could help, but she was on a fixed income and the apartment was only 1 bedroom, and she didn't have space. Her older sister said the same thing, more quickly. A friend from the medical group offered her couch for 2 weeks, which became 10 days when the friend's boyfriend moved back in and the apartment became too crowded. Clara spent those 10 days sending applications from the library, calling numbers from rental listings that came back as already leased or unaffordable, and trying to explain to Lily that this was a temporary situation in terms that would satisfy an 8-year-old without being an obvious lie. Lily was not a child who required elaborate explanations. She had inherited from somewhere. Clara suspected from the grandmother she had barely known on Clara's father's side, a quality of watchful patience that children her age rarely possessed. She asked questions carefully and only when she had already thought through the probable answers. She had not cried when they packed the last boxes. She had sat in the empty apartment and looked at the walls for a moment, then picked up her backpack and walked out ahead of her mother. She was the best thing in Clara's life. She was also the weight of every fear Clara carried, the reason every setback felt existential rather than merely difficult. When Clara lay in the back seat of the Honda Civic on cold nights with Lily pressed against her for warmth, she could feel her daughter's breathing against her collarbone, and she would stare at the roof of the car and perform calculations that never produced a satisfying answer. The shelter on Beaumont Street had a 3-week waiting list. The motels that accepted weekly rates cost more per month than she had coming in. The food bank on Wednesdays could bridge the gap on groceries, but it couldn't bridge the gap on everything else. $300. She had $341 in her checking account. She had been holding that amount like a life raft, doling out $8 here and $12 there, filling the gas tank in $10 increments, buying only what was immediately necessary, terrified of what would happen when it ran out. She had been telling herself the money was for an emergency. She stood in the laundromat staring at the photograph she had just taken and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has run out of other options, that this was the emergency. The auction was 2 days away. She spent those 2 days doing what research she could. The county assessor's website had a record for the property, thin on details but consistent. A farmhouse originally built sometime in the early 1900s, sitting on 16 acres of mostly uncleared land, last occupied in the late 1960s according to the tax records, though some neighbors in the area reportedly claimed it had been empty longer than that. The previous owner of record was a man named Harlan Greer, deceased 1971, no will filed, no heirs who had come forward to claim the property in the 50-plus years since. 50 years. She kept returning to that number. A house sitting empty for half a century. She found 3 photographs on a historical society website, grainy and taken from a distance, showing a 2-story frame farmhouse with a wide front porch and a barn that had partially collapsed. In one image, a man stood on the porch steps with his back to the camera. In another, the house was photographed in winter, snow banked against the foundation, the windows dark. In the third, taken apparently in summer based on the foliage, you could see that the porch railing had already begun to deteriorate, and that something, a vine or a climbing plant of some kind, had taken hold of the south wall and was working its way upward. Every visible detail argued against it. The search results for the town of Calder Falls were not encouraging either. Population under 1,000. Nearest grocery store 14 miles away. Nearest hospital 32 miles. The county itself was listed in several economic reports as among the most economically distressed in the state, which was itself one of the more economically distressed in the region. The kind of place that appears on lists of towns the country has forgotten, where the main employer closed sometime in the 90s, and the young people left, and the ones who stayed made do. Clara called her sister again, not to ask for help this time, but because she needed to say the plan out loud to another person before she did it. Her sister's name was Dana, and she had the kind of voice that communicated impatience through its very neutrality. She listened without interrupting, which was more courtesy than Clara had expected. Then she said, "Clara, you're going to spend your last $300 on a condemned house in the middle of nowhere. It might not be condemned. The listing says structural integrity unknown. That's the legal phrase for we think it might fall on you. It's 16 acres. Of what? Weeds?" Clara looked across the parking lot at the car where Lily was doing homework in the back seat. Geometry worksheets spread across her lap, pencil moving with the methodical patience that always made Clara feel simultaneously proud and heartbroken. "I don't have a better idea," Clara said. The silence that followed contained Dana's full opinion on that statement without her needing to express it. What happens if you go out there and the house is literally a pile of lumber? You've spent your last money. You're stuck. I'm already stuck. Another silence, shorter and of a different quality. Mom thinks you should come back to Columbus and stay with her until you find work. Mom said there wasn't room. She changed her mind. Or she's changing her mind. She's still working up to calling you about it. Clara watched Lily erase something on the worksheet and start over. I'll think about it, she said, which both of them understood to mean she had already decided. The night before the auction, she told Lily what she was planning. She sat in the back seat beside her daughter and explained it plainly, without softening the uncertainty or inflating the possibility, because Lily was the kind of child who could detect both and resented being managed. Lily listened with her knees pulled to her chest, bear-shaped socks pointing at the seat back. When Clara finished, Lily was quiet for a moment. Would we live there? If it's livable, maybe. For a while I figure out next steps. Is it far? About 4 hours. Lily nodded. She looked out the window at the parking lot, at the pool of orange sodium light falling across the pavement. Is it scary? Clara considered the photographs. The empty windows. The vine crawling up the wall. The collapsed barn. I don't know yet, she said. Probably a little. Lily thought about that. Then, okay, I want to come. You'll stay with Mrs. Dalton while I want to come, Mom. Clara looked at her daughter for a long moment. Lily met her eyes steadily, chin set, with the expression she wore when she had already decided something and was simply waiting for the adults to catch up. Okay, Clara said. The auction took place in the county courthouse basement in a room that smelled of old carpet and fluorescent lighting. There were 7 properties on the docket that morning. Clara arrived early and sat in a plastic chair near the back with Lily beside her, both of them wearing their better clothes, the ones they kept separate in a bag specifically for situations that required them to look less visibly desperate than they were. There were 11 other bidders in the room, mostly men, mostly older, the kind of people who attended these things regularly and knew which properties were worth pursuing. They spoke to each other in low voices before the auction started, clearly acquainted, and their familiarity with the proceedings gave the room the quality of a gathering Clara had arrived at without an invitation. 4 of the properties sold quickly, 2 of them in brief bidding contests that pushed the prices well above what Clara had available. One man in a canvas jacket bought a vacant commercial lot for $4,200 without visible emotion. Another pair of bidders competed briefly for a residential parcel before one of them dropped out. When the auctioneer reached the Greer Farmhouse, he read the description in the flat cadence of someone who had read it many times before. Rural Route 7, 16 acres, farmhouse structure, condition as is. He paused just slightly before adding, this property has been on the county rolls since 2001 without a buyer. Starting bid is $200. Nobody moved. Clara raised her hand. The auctioneer looked at her with the mild surprise of someone who had not expected that particular hand. 200. Do I have 250? She watched the room. Watched the man in the canvas jacket look at his neighbor and give the smallest headshake. Watched the other bidders check their papers or study the ceiling. Going once at 200. Going twice. Someone in the back row cleared his throat. Clara's grip on Lily's hand tightened. Sold, $200. She paid the remaining balance in cash at the county clerk's window 20 minutes later and walked out of the courthouse holding a receipt, a deed transfer form, and a single key on a rusted ring, into October sunlight that felt colder and cleaner than anything she had experienced in months. Lily walked beside her, reading the key like an artifact. It's really old. Really old, Clara agreed. Are we going now? Clara looked at the car, looked at the receipt, looked at the $141 now remaining in her account, and the 4 hours of road between them and whatever was waiting on rural Route 7. Yeah, she said. We're going now. The drive took longer than the map suggested, because the last 40 minutes of it involved roads that the mapping app had never personally traveled and therefore gave directions for with misplaced confidence. The state highway became a county road. The county road became a gravel track, and the gravel track became something that was only barely distinguishable from the surrounding field by the slight depression in the earth where vehicles had passed before, probably years ago, probably not often. The Honda made sounds that Clara's mechanical knowledge was insufficient to diagnose, but her instincts were sufficient to dread. She kept the speed low and watched the fuel gauge with the vigilance of someone who had already calculated how far it was to the nearest gas station and how much a tow truck would cost. Lily sat forward in the passenger seat, looking out the windshield with the focused attention of an explorer. She had been talking for the first 2 hours of the drive, the way she sometimes did when she was nervous but didn't want to appear nervous, a steady stream of observations and questions and small stories. But as the landscape had thickened and the roads had narrowed, she had grown quieter, and now she was simply watching. The fields on either side of the track had the exhausted look of land that had once been worked and wasn't anymore. Fences leaned. Old fence posts stood at angles that suggested they had been left to the weather for long enough that the weather was winning. At one point, they passed the concrete foundation of a building that had been burned or demolished at some point in the past, ringed by the ghost of what might once have been a kitchen garden, now indistinguishable from the surrounding vegetation. People used to live here, Lily said. Yeah. They left. Looks like. The farmhouse appeared without warning, or rather it had been visible for the last several minutes, and Clara had not fully processed it as the destination because it was smaller than the photographs had suggested and because the surrounding overgrowth had, over the decades, worked to make the building appear less like a structure and more like a feature of the landscape, something that had grown rather than been built. 2 stories of wood and brick beneath a roof that was still, against all apparent probability, intact. A wide front porch listing slightly to the east, its boards gray with weathering. Windows opaque with decades of grime. The south wall half consumed by the vine she had seen in the photograph, which had in the intervening years taken hold so thoroughly that it was now structural in its own right, its roots sunk into the gaps in the mortar, its branches as thick as a child's wrist. Clara stopped the car at the point where the track ended in a rough clearing that might once have served as a yard, and sat looking at the house for a moment. Lily sat looking at it too. It's still there, Lily said, with a tone that mixed relief and something harder to name. It is. It looks like something out of a story. Clara thought about how to respond to that and couldn't find the right words, so she just opened the door and got out. The air hit her immediately, cold and clean in a way that city air never quite managed, carrying something under the chill that she couldn't identify at first, a depth to the smell of the dry grass and the bare trees at the field's edge that felt ancient and mineral, like the smell of a stone turned over after a long time. Lily came around the front of the car and stood beside her. She did not take Clara's hand this time. She just stood there, looking. The house looked back. They approached across what had once been a yard and was now a tangle of dried weeds and a few volunteer saplings that had been small trees the last time anyone had walked through this space. The porch steps held Clara's weight with a creaking protest that made her test each one before committing, but they held. The boards of the porch surface were soft in places where moisture had gotten under the paint in some long-ago wet season and rotted the wood from beneath, but the structure itself had been built with a solidity that decades of neglect had bent without quite breaking. She used the key. It turned on the second try, the mechanism grinding as though it had partially seized, then releasing with a snap that sounded disproportionately loud in the afternoon quiet. The door swung inward, and the smell that came out was unlike anything Clara had expected. She had braced for rot, for mold, for the damp, vegetable smell of a space that had been sealed against air too long. Instead, what hit her was dry, old, paper and wood and dust, and something underneath those that she had no immediate word for, something that reminded her of the way a coin smelled when you held it in your palm for a long time. Metal. The faint ambient smell of metal. She filed that away without dwelling on it and stepped inside. The entrance was a narrow hallway that opened into a front room larger than the exterior had suggested. A stone fireplace occupied most of the north wall, its hearth filled with leaves that had entered through some opening in the chimney and accumulated over the years into a dry, papery mass. The floor was wide plank hardwood, filthy but structurally sound under her feet. A staircase against the east wall led up to what she assumed was the second floor. The windows, opaque from outside, admitted light in a way that was diffuse and gray but sufficient to see by. Lily came in behind her and stopped, taking it in. The room had the feel of a place that had been left in mid-thought. There was a wooden chair near the fireplace with a homemade cushion on it, the fabric rotted to threads, but the frame still standing. A small table against the wall held a kerosene lamp whose glass chimney was unbroken, the reservoir long dry. Hooks beside the front door still held the shadow shapes where coats had hung, the paint darker in those spots, protected from whatever slow bleaching the rest of the wall had endured. "Somebody just left," Lily said. 50 years ago. Lily walked to the fireplace and crouched to look at the accumulated leaves. She picked one up and it crumbled at her touch. "It's not dirty inside the way I expected. I thought it would be wet and disgusting. The roof is intact. That makes a difference." Clara moved through the front room into what had been the kitchen, a larger space that had once held a wood-burning range judging by the iron bracket on the wall where a stovepipe had vented. The range itself was gone, probably removed at some point, but the bracket remained, and the floor in the spot where it had stood was blackened by heat and slightly sunken from the weight. A dry sink along the east wall. Shelves that had once held canned goods, their bare boards now empty except for a few glass jars whose lids had rusted to their threads. Lily found a calendar on the wall behind the kitchen door. She studied it. "Mom, this says 1963. Clara looked at it. A farm supply company's promotional calendar, the kind they used to give away, showing a pastoral image of a hay bale and a red barn on a sky so blue it looked painted. The month visible was September. Several dates had been marked with pencil notations. Hay delivery on the 4th. Doctor appointment on the 12th. A birthday circled on the 23rd with a small star drawn beside it. Someone had been living here in September of 1963, keeping their schedule, planning ahead, assuming there was more to come. Then they had walked out and not come back, and no one had come back for them, and the calendar had stayed on the wall for more than 60 years. Clara thought about that for a moment and felt the specific weight of a stranger's abandoned, ordinary life, the weight of it. Then she kept moving. The back door was swollen in its frame and required force to open. It led onto a small covered porch that looked out over what had once been a kitchen garden. The same basic construction as the front porch, but simpler, less decorative, clearly functional. Beyond it, 50 yards or so across ground that had been cleared at some point and was now reclaiming itself, stood the barn. Or what remained of it. One end wall had come down, probably years ago, and the roof on that side had followed, so that only the far 2/3 of the structure still stood, the collapsed portion left where it had fallen like a creature that had simply lain down. Between the back porch and the barn, slightly to the left, slightly obscured by the dried stalks of whatever tall grass had taken over that section of the yard, was the cellar door. It was the traditional kind, 2 angled wooden panels set into a concrete surround flush with the ground, with an iron ring handle on the right side panel. Old iron, the ring gone brown with oxidation. The wood of the panels was weathered to the same gray as the barn siding, cracked along the grain in the way that exterior wood cracks when it alternately soaks and dries over many seasons. Someone had laid a large flat stone across the doors at some point, probably to hold them shut against the wind, and the stone had been there long enough that the grass around its perimeter had grown up and over the edges, partially embedding it. Clara stood on the back porch looking at it for a moment before she registered what she was looking at. Lily came to stand beside her and looked too. "Is that a cellar?" Lily asked. "Yes." "Under the ground?" "That's what a cellar is." Lily considered this. "Are we going in it?" "Not tonight," Clara said, with more certainty than she entirely felt. "We need to check the rest of the house first. Make sure we can stay the night. Then we deal with the cellar." The second floor had 3 rooms. A bedroom at the front with a window that overlooked the porch, a smaller room in the middle that might have been a child's room based on the lower hook on the wall, and the small shelf built into the alcove beside the window, and a third room at the back that was empty except for a metal bed frame with no mattress and a wooden crate turned upside down against the far wall. The floorboards throughout were solid. The ceiling showed some staining from what might have been a roof leak repaired long ago, but the patches were dry and the ceiling had not come down. The house was cold, but not wet. That was the most important thing. Cold she could manage. What meant mold, structural decay, the slow dissolution of things that were supposed to hold. She spent the last of the daylight doing a thorough walkthrough, testing floors, checking window frames for rot, examining the interior walls for signs of water intrusion. What she found was a house that had been neglected for decades, but had been built well enough to survive that neglect without catastrophic failure. The porch had weak boards. The kitchen sink had corroded beyond use. Several windows needed reglazing. The chimney needed professional evaluation before the fireplace could be used. But the structure stood. The roof held. The walls were plumb. $300. She sat on the front porch steps as the light failed and the temperature dropped noticeably, eating the last of the crackers and peanut butter she'd bought at a gas station 2 days ago, and Lily sat beside her, both of them looking out at the fields going dark at the edges, the sky overhead still faintly light in the west. I like it, Lily said. Clara looked at her. I know it's old and broken, Lily said, but I like it. It feels like it wants someone here. Clara did not have an answer for that, so she said nothing, and they sat together in the gathering cold and watched the dark come in. They slept that first night in their sleeping bags on the floor of the front room, which was the warmest part of the house because the stone fireplace, even in used, retained some thermal mass, and the ceiling was lower than in the rest of the rooms. Clara built a small fire in the fireplace, using the accumulated leaves and some dry which she found stacked against the back of the porch, and they lay watching it with the specific contentment of people who have been cold for a long time and have finally gotten warm. Lily fell asleep in less than 20 minutes. Clara lay awake longer, listening to the house settle around her in the way old houses do, the timbers adjusting to the temperature change, tiny movements and sounds that in the absence of other noise became very present. The wind outside moved through the trees at the field edge and through the gaps in the porch boards and under the back door, and the house breathed with it, not in a way that felt threatening, but in a way that felt inhabited, as though the building itself were aware of them. She was almost asleep when she heard it. Not a settling sound. Not the wind. Something else, lower in the building, a resonance that she could feel more in her sternum than hear with her ears. A tone, almost, the way a note played on an instrument feels in the chest of the person sitting nearest to it. Not repeated, not rhythmic, just once, and brief, and then gone. She lay still, listening. The house was silent. She told herself it was the temperature change, the metal in the chimney or the pipes or the foundation shifting with the dropping cold. She told herself it was nothing, and she believed it, mostly, and eventually she slept. She woke in the gray early light to find Lily already up, sitting cross-legged near the fireplace's cooling embers, drawing in the small sketchbook she kept in her bag. You're drawing, Clara said. The cellar door, Lily said without looking up. Clara sat up, pushing her hair back. Why? I dreamed about it. Lily kept drawing. I dreamed the doors were open and there was light coming from underneath. White light, the kind you get from quartz when the sun hits it right. Like crystals. Clara looked at her daughter's drawing. It was careful and detailed in the way Lily's drawings always were. The two angled panels rendered with attention to the grain of the weathered wood, the iron ring reproduced in its rusted specificity, the flat stone across the center. And in the gap at the seam between the two panels, she had drawn a thin line of light. Dreams are dreams, Clara said. I know. Lily looked up. Can we go look at it today? They had other things to do first. Clara had made a list before falling asleep. Assess structural priorities, find the nearest town and locate building supplies. Call the county utilities office about getting power and water restored to the property. The list was practical and sequential and entirely reasonable. They went to look at the cellar door first anyway. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of fall morning where every surface had a slight frost to it, and the air tasted sharp and clean. Their breath made small clouds. The grass underfoot was stiff and crunchy, crackling with each step. The cellar door looked smaller in the morning light than it had appeared the evening before, which was the opposite of how frightening things usually worked. The weathered wood, the rusted ring, the flat stone across the seam. In morning light, it was simply old and weathered and somewhat ordinary. Clara moved the stone first. It was heavier than she expected, dense and thick, the kind of stone that gets laid for a reason rather than placed decoratively. She worked it to one side and stood looking at the doors. The iron ring was stiff with oxidation, but turned when she gripped it with both hands and pulled. The right panel lifted with a groan, wood swollen in its frame, resisting, then giving. Cold air came up from below, the same cold metal smell she had noticed when she'd first opened the front door of the house, but stronger here. More concentrated. She pulled the door all the way up and propped it open with a piece of timber she found nearby, then leaned over and looked down. Stone steps descended into darkness. The walls of the cellar were stone, unmortared, laid dry by hand. The floor below was dirt, as far as she could see in the limited light from the open door. Lily leaned over beside her and looked down. We need a light, Clara said. She retrieved the flashlight from the car's glove compartment and came back to find Lily still standing at the edge, looking down with the focused patience that was her most characteristic expression. Clara tested the first step with her foot. Stone solid. She went down, hand trailing the cold wall, Lily following without being asked. The cellar was larger than the footprint of the house suggested, extending back under what would have been the kitchen. The ceiling was low, the top of Clara's head just clearing the rough wooden beams above. The smell was stronger down here, cold and dry and metallic, and underneath those something else, something that Clara's nose processed without her conscious mind immediately supplying a category for it. Something like old paper. Something like oil. She played the flashlight around the walls. Shelves had been built along 3 walls, floor to ceiling, rough wooden boards laid across wooden pegs driven into gaps between the stones. Many of the shelves were empty. Some held the remains of old mason jars, their rubber seals long gone, the glass clouded. A few wooden crates occupied the lower shelves, their contents invisible. Without opening them, the floor was dirt but beaten hard and smooth, the way a floor gets when it has been walked on daily for decades. In the center of the room, the floor was slightly elevated, a low mound not quite 8 inches high, smooth-edged, regular in its shape, the kind of feature that was either a natural variation in the ground beneath or had been deliberately formed. Clara crouched beside it and looked at it more closely. It was too even to be natural. The edges were too consistent, describing a shape that was almost but not quite rectangular, slightly wider at one end than the other. Lily crouched beside her. What is that? I don't know. It looks like something's underneath it. It does. Clara pressed her palm flat to the surface of the mound and felt the resistance of compressed earth. She pressed harder. Nothing moved. She pressed in a different spot, closer to the edge, and felt something different under her hand. Not the smooth compaction of old dirt, but something harder, the slight give of old wood, the edge of a board. She sat back on her heels and looked at the mound for a long moment. The metallic smell was strongest here, above this specific spot in the floor, above this irregular shape in the dirt that might be nothing and might not be nothing. Mom, Lily said. Yeah, I think something's down there. Clara stood up, dusted her hands on her jeans, and looked at the low ceiling, the stone walls, the bare shelves, the closed darkness at the back of the cellar. She looked at the mound in the floor, at its 2 even edges, at the slight depression that ran along its center like the seam of the 2 cellar doors above. She thought about the house, about the way it had been left in mid-thought. The calendar on the wall stopped at September 1963, the kerosene lamp unlit, the coats gone but the hooks remaining. She thought about Harlan Greer, deceased 1971, no will filed, no heirs, the county holding the property for 50 years without anyone coming forward to claim it. She thought about the smell. She thought about $300. Get me the folding shovel from the car, she said. Lily was already moving up the steps. Clara stood in the cellar alone for a moment, the flashlight steady in her hand, listening. The house was quiet above her. The fields were quiet outside. Nothing moved in the cellar shadows. But the smell was there, the old metallic smell that she still hadn't categorized, that she was only now beginning to think she might recognize from somewhere she hadn't expected to recognize it. The smell of old metal. Large amounts of it. The particular way that metal smelled in an enclosed space when it had been sitting in cold, dry dark for a very long time. She had grown up in Columbus. She had not spent much of her adult life around metal in quantity. But she had a memory, sharp and specific, from a school field trip at age 11 to a museum exhibition of recovered Civil War artifacts, where an educator had opened a crate of buckles and blades and coin fragments recovered from battlefield sites, and the smell that had come out of that crate had been exactly this. Not iron, not rust, gold. Not the smell of gold exactly. She knew even then that gold itself was famously odorless, but the smell of gold objects. Objects that had been in contact with other metals and with human hands and with the specific chemistry of long dark storage. Objects that were old and dense and had been sealed away from light for longer than she had been alive. She heard Lily's footsteps on the stone stairs behind her. She turned and took the shovel. The first strike of the blade into the mound went 4 inches before it hit something that wasn't earth. A solid resistance that transmitted through the handle into her palms in a way that was unmistakably different from stone. Softer than stone, harder than wood. She moved to a different spot along the edge and tried again. Same resistance, same depth, same quality of material under the blade. She set the shovel aside and began moving the dirt by hand, brushing it away from the surface of whatever lay beneath, working carefully and slowly the way you would work if you were afraid of what you might damage. Lily knelt beside her and did the same, neither of them speaking, their breath coming in visible clouds in the flashlight's periphery. The dirt was dry and loose once you got past the top inch, the compaction she had felt from above. It brushed away easily, and what came clear beneath it, emerging in the flashlight beam as she worked her way across the surface, was a seam. The seam of a lid. Not a door. Not a board. A lid. Metal. Flat. With a seam along its center and along all four edges that described a rectangle roughly 4 feet wide by 6 feet long, and hinges along one of the long edges that she exposed last, pulling away the last of the dirt from their housings and feeling how substantial they were, how precisely machined, how different in quality from the rough construction of the cellar around them. She sat back and looked at it. A vault door, laid horizontal in the floor of the cellar of an abandoned farmhouse on 16 acres in rural Missouri, hidden under 8 inches of packed dirt, and before that under 60 years of accumulated silence and disuse, and the specific determined forgetting of a man who had filed no will and left no heirs and died in 1971 with whatever secret this was still intact. Lily's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Mama," she said. The cellar door just opened itself. Clara looked at her. Lily pointed, not at the vault, but at the wooden door above them, the one Clara had propped open with the timber. It was swinging, slowly, on its own, not blown by any wind that had been present a moment ago, pivoting on its rusty hinges as if responding to something, drawing shut by degrees, cutting down the column of morning light from above. Both of them watched it close. The cellar went dark except for the flashlight. Clara sat in that dark with the cold metal of the vault door under her fingertips and listened to the absolute quiet of the house above and the field outside, and the early October morning that had been there for all of recorded time and would be there long after this moment passed. Then Lily turned toward her in the dark, and Clara could see the whites of her daughter's eyes. "What's in it, Mom?" Clara looked down at the vault and the floor, at its machined seams, at its hinges that spoke of construction designed to last longer than whoever had built it. She traced one edge with her fingertip and felt how the metal was cold in a way that went beyond the temperature of the cellar, the specific dead cold of metal that had been in the dark for a very long time. "I don't know," she said. But the way she said it made Lily sit up straighter, because it wasn't the voice her mother used when she genuinely didn't know something. It was the voice she used when she knew something was coming that she wasn't sure yet how to name. "But you think," Lily started. "I think," Clara said, "we need to find out what's inside it." She placed both hands flat on the vault lid and pushed experimentally. Nothing moved. She found the edge of the lid, ran her finger along it until she found what she was searching for, and found it. A recessed latch, the kind that sat flush when locked, designed to be invisible unless you knew to look for it. Cold metal, smooth from machining, 60 years of nothing touching it. She needed a key. Or she needed to know if the man who had owned this house, who had died in 1971 without a will and without heirs, had left a key somewhere in the house she now owned for $300. She looked up at the closed cellar door above them. Then she stood, put the flashlight in Lily's hand, and started up the stairs. Behind her, in the flashlight beam, the vault lay in the dirt with its lid reflecting the light in the flat, patient way of objects that have been waiting a very long time. The house had held this secret for more than half a century. Through summer heat and winter cold. Through the long years of no one. Through the county assessor's records and the auctioneer's flat voice and the empty room full of bidders who hadn't raised their hands. It had waited for Clara Weston and the $300 she had been holding back for an emergency. Now she was going to find out what it had been keeping. She pushed open the back door of the farmhouse and stepped into the morning light with the specific focused urgency of someone who has just seen something that changes the shape of every decision that came before it, and she began to search. The kitchen first. She pulled every drawer, working through the dry goods cabinet and the narrow pantry off the east wall, her hands moving through dust and the papery remains of things that had been stored and forgotten. She found old bolts, a rusted can opener, Two pieces of broken crockery wrapped in newspaper dated from 1961, a wooden spool of thread gone brittle and gray. She found a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine, their envelopes too damaged to read. She found a tobacco tin with a hinged lid containing a single large button and nothing else. No key. She moved into the front room. The table by the window had a single drawer that stuck. She worked it loose and found a collection of objects that told a story about a man's daily life without telling her the story she needed. A penknife with a cracked handle, a stub of pencil, a piece of folded paper that crumbled at its creases when she opened it, leaving her holding 4 quadrants of what had once been a hand-drawn map of the property, the fields and the structures marked in ink, the house at the center, the barn to its right, the cellar rendered as a small square behind the kitchen. And in the corner of the map, in small, neat handwriting, a phrase she had to hold the paper directly to the window light to read. What is below is older than the trouble. Keep it whole. She stood at the window for a long time with those pieces of paper in her hands. What is below is older than the trouble. She put the pieces in her jacket pocket and kept looking. The staircase. She checked each riser, running her hands along the undersides of the steps, an old place to hide things. Nothing. The second-floor bedroom. The narrow middle room with its child's hook on the wall. The small room at the back with the metal bed frame and the wooden crate. She moved the crate and found that it was heavier than it looked, because it was not empty. Lifting the lid revealed a mass of folded cloth, old flannel, that had been packed around something the way you would pack around something you wanted to survive whatever time it was going to face. She lifted the cloth away, carefully, layer by layer. At the center was a tin box, larger than the tobacco tin from the kitchen, roughly the size of a shoebox, with a simple clasp on the front. No lock. She opened it. Inside, a collection of photographs, a folded document in an envelope sealed with wax, a handful of coins loose in the bottom, and a key. Different from the front door key, different in every dimension that mattered. Where the front door key was iron and rough, this one was brass, smooth, heavy for its size, with a precise cut that spoke of a locksmith who had known what he was making and for what purpose. Clara held it in the flat of her palm and felt the weight of it. She held up one of the photographs to the window light. It showed a man she didn't recognize standing in front of what she now recognized as the back porch of this house. He was perhaps 60 years old in the photograph, lean and serious-faced, wearing work clothes that placed the image somewhere in the mid-20th century. He was not smiling. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not hostile but contained, the expression of someone who understood that this moment was being recorded and who wanted it recorded accurately, without prettiness. At his feet was a metal case, roughly the size and shape of the vault lid she had found under the cellar floor. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same neat handwriting from the map, Harlan, 1959. The second photograph was older. Different paper, different light, a different decade entirely. 2 men and a woman standing in a field that she recognized from its proportions as the field south of the house, the one that was now fully overgrown. They were well dressed for field work, which meant they were not farmers, and the woman held a leather briefcase with both hands. The man on the right was pointing at something off camera, and the man on the left was looking at the ground with an expression that Clara could only read, across the distance of whatever year this had been taken, as discomfort. She didn't know who these people were. She put the photographs in her pocket with the map pieces and turned to the sealed envelope. The wax seal was intact. She broke it carefully with her thumbnail and removed the document inside, unfolding it with the deliberate patience of someone who understood she was touching something that had been folded and waiting for a very long time. It was a single page of handwriting, dense and careful, the hand of a man who had written this out more than once in his head before he set it down on paper. To whoever this property comes to, it read. She sat down on the floor beside the crate and read. The man named Harlan Greer had not been a farmer in any conventional sense, though he had kept the appearance of one. He had been, by his own account, a salvage man. That was the word he used for it, a collector of things that others discarded or overlooked or didn't understand the value of. He had spent 40 years acquiring objects in a region of the country that had been, in the decades before his time, the site of 2 significant things: a prosperous mining operation that had run from the 1870s through the 1920s and had produced, before its collapse, an extraordinary amount of recovered gold, silver, and rare mineral specimens that had passed through private hands and tax records with the looseness of an era before federal oversight tightened the routes such things traveled. And a community of farmers and tradespeople who had come west with capital in the forms that families in that period had of storing capital: coin, bullion, jewelry, and the particular class of collectible object that acquired value through age, rarity, and the condition of the specific history attached to it. Harlan Greer had not stolen these things. He was precise on this point. Every item he had acquired had come to him through legitimate transaction, sale or trade or inheritance, from people who often understood less about what they were selling than he did. He did not consider this dishonest. He considered it attentive. Over 40 years, working quietly and without announcing himself, he had assembled in the vault beneath his cellar floor a collection whose components he listed in the document with the careful precision of a man who understood that a list is a form of witness. Gold coin and bullion from the mining operation and its associates. Silver plate and jewelry from a dozen families whose names meant nothing now but had meant something once in the county. Mineral specimens of a quality that he described in terms she didn't fully follow, but which conveyed an impression of extraordinary rarity. And a body of what he called paper wealth: bonds, share certificates, deeds to mineral rights in the region, documents whose value he could not fully assess, but which he was confident would prove significant. He had sealed the vault in 1959 because a thing had happened that he described only obliquely: a visit from men who asked questions he did not want to answer, and he had understood from their questions that it was better for the vault to not exist than for it to be found. He had covered it with 8 inches of packed earth, and he had gone on living on the property for 12 more years, and when he died, he had filed no will because a will would require disclosing assets. And disclosing assets would require explaining the vault. And explaining the vault would mean the vault would be opened by people who had no claim to what was inside it. He had waited, instead, for someone to find it. He had written the document as a record, as a proof of title, as a testimony that the contents of the vault were legitimately acquired and legitimately owned by whoever had come to this point through legal possession of the property. The last line read, "The key is in the house. If you're reading this, you deserve to know what it opens." Clara sat on the floor of the back room with the document in her hands and the brass key in her pocket and the sound of Lily coming up the stairs behind her. Lily appeared in the doorway. She took in her mother's expression. She looked at the document. "You found something," Lily said. "I found the key. And a letter. A letter from the man who owned this house before us." Lily came fully into the room and sat cross-legged on the floor across from her mother, settling with the natural ease of a child who had learned to be comfortable in many different kinds of floor in many different rooms. She looked at Clara and waited. Clara looked at her daughter. The morning light came through the window behind Lily and fell across the bare floorboards between them and lit the floating dust the way morning light always lit dust in old houses, turning it brief and golden. Lily's eyes were the particular brown that went to amber when light hit them from the side. Her hair needed brushing. She was wearing the red sweatshirt with the fraying cuffs that she refused to let Clara throw away. She was 8 years old. She had been sleeping in a car for 11 days. Clara folded the document back into the envelope and put it in her pocket with the map pieces and the photographs. "The vault," she said. "I think I know what's in it." Lily straightened slightly. "What?" "I'm not sure yet. The letter says it's been sealed since 1959. Clara turned the brass key over in her palm. "The man who sealed it thought it was worth protecting for 60 years. Lily looked at the key, then at her mother's face, then back at the key. "Are we going to open it?" Clara stood up, steadying herself with one hand on the wall, and looked out the window at the back field, at the cellar door lying flat against the ground where it had swung shut on its own, at the barn with its one collapsed end standing under the October sky, like something that had decided to stay despite everything. 60 years of silence in that vault. Her $300. The key in her hand. The 11 days of car sleeping behind them, and the $0 of plan ahead of them, and the 8-year-old girl looking up at her from the floor with amber eyes. "Yeah," Clara said. "We're going to open it." They went back down the stone steps together, Clara first, Lily one step behind, the flashlight cutting a white circle across the dirt floor. The cellar door above them was closed. Clara had propped it open again before they descended, wedging the timber back under the edge, and yet the morning light came down at a different angle than it had before, lower and more oblique, because more time had passed than she'd realized while she was searching the house. The vault lay as she had left it, its lid exposed, the dirt brushed away from its seams. In the cleaner light of the flashlight beam, it looked different from how it had looked the first time, less like a discovery and more like a fact. It had been here a long time. It was not going anywhere. It was simply waiting for her to accept what it was. She crouched beside it and located the recessed latch she had found with her fingertip earlier, pressing into the slight depression in the lid's surface near the right-hand edge. The latch sat flush with the metal, designed to be invisible, and when she pressed it, the mechanism gave a click that was quiet but clean and precise, the sound of something engineered to work and working. She fit the brass key into the lock. It went in smoothly. She looked at Lily, who was standing 2 feet away with the flashlight in both hands, its beam steady. Lily gave a single small nod. Clara turned the key. The sound was not dramatic. It was the sound of a well-made lock doing what it was built to do, a series of internal movements that she could feel transmitted through the key into her palm, a sequence of releases, each one clicking into place in order, until the last tumbler fell, and the lock opened, and the latch disengaged. She gripped the edge of the lid with both hands, positioned herself, and lifted. The lid was heavy. Cast iron, she would later be told, 1/2 inch thick, hinged along the back edge by 3 brass hinges as substantial as anything on a bank vault door. She had to stand and use her full weight in both arms to get it moving. And it moved slowly, the hinges turning without complaint, smooth from whatever lubrication had been applied when they were installed, the metal cold against her hands in a way that went from uncomfortable to painful as she held the edge and pushed the lid up and back and felt it lock into its open position with a clunk that resonated through the cellar floor. The cold came up first. A wave of air so dry it crackled in her sinuses, the concentrated preserved cold of a sealed space that had not been opened in 63 years. Not damp, not foul, dry and cold and very still, the way the air was in. The back of a museum storage room, the particular quality of air that had been doing nothing but sitting quietly in the dark for as long as she had been alive, and then some. Then Lily moved the flashlight beam down into the open vault. Clara had been holding a mental image of what she expected to find, based on Harlan Greer's letter, based on the metallic smell, based on the specific weight that the brass key had carried in her palm. She had been managing that image carefully, keeping it from growing too large, telling herself to be prepared for something smaller than anticipated, something degraded by time, something that turned out to be less than it sounded in a handwritten letter from 1959. None of that preparation was adequate. The vault was 3 feet deep and roughly the same dimensions she had estimated from the lid, 4x6. Its interior walls were lined in wood, tongue-in-groove boards fitted tightly to the metal exterior, and the wood had been treated with something that had preserved it against moisture through 6 decades of Missouri winters and summers. The floor of the vault was wood as well, the same treated boards, and on that floor, arranged in orderly rows, were objects wrapped in oilcloth and heavy canvas, and in some cases wooden boxes of varying sizes, all of it packed tightly, efficiently, with no wasted space, the arrangement of a man who had taken his time and done this right. Clara looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached in and picked up the nearest wrapped bundle. It was heavy in a way that recalibrated her expectations of the word heavy. She knew intellectually that gold was dense, denser than most things people routinely lifted, but intellectual knowledge and the physical reality of holding something that weighed far more than its volume suggested were different experiences entirely. She set it on the dirt floor beside the vault and unwrapped the oilcloth. Gold coins, stacked in a cylinder the way coins were stacked in bank rolls, held together with a band of tarnished metal wire. She held the flashlight close. The faces on the coins were faces she recognized from history books, American eagles on double eagle $20 gold pieces, the kind that had been legal tender before the federal government recalled them in 1933 and that had, in the intervening decades, become extraordinarily valuable not just for their gold content, but for their numismatic rarity. She set them down. She reached back into the vault and picked up another bundle, this one in canvas. Heavier still. Inside, nested in more oilcloth, was a bar of gold approximately the size and shape of a large hardcover book. No markings she could immediately read. The surface dull with age but unmistakable. Lily crouched at the edge of the vault, flashlight tracking from item to item. "Mom," she said. Her voice had lost its usual steadiness. "Mom, how much is, I don't know yet. But it's a lot." Clara looked into the vault at the orderly rows of wrapped and boxed contents, at the depth of the space, at the systematic packing that spoke of someone who had put many things in here one at a time over many years, making room, always making room. She thought about Harlan Greer's 40 years of acquiring. She thought about the letters list: gold coin and bullion, silver, mineral specimens, rare paper wealth. "It's a lot," she said. She lifted out one of the wooden boxes. It had a simple clasp, no lock. Inside, nested in material she would later learn was chamois leather, were mineral specimens the size of her fist, irregular in shape, and even in flashlight, even through decades of accumulated surface dust, visibly extraordinary. Crystals of quartz studded with what she initially thought was decoration, before she rotated one in the light and understood that what she was looking at was not decoration. The inclusions in the crystal were gold, native gold, still in its host matrix, the kind of specimen that came out of hard rock mines in this part of the country in the late 1800s when the veins were still rich and nobody fully understood yet what they had. The kind of specimen that ended up in museum collections and private estates, and, apparently, in wooden boxes and sealed vaults under the floors of abandoned farmhouses in Missouri. She set the box down very carefully. "We need help," she said. Lily looked at her. "I can't assess this. I don't know what any of it's worth. I need someone who does." Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the vault, at the gold coins and the bar and the mineral specimen box and the dozens of other wrapped and packed items she hadn't touched yet. She thought about what happened if she tried to sell any of this without knowing what it was. She thought about what happened if she told the wrong person. She thought about the two men in the old photographs standing in the field with the woman holding the briefcase, the one labeled 1959. The visit Harlan Greer had described obliquely as the reason he sealed the vault. She thought about what it meant that he had trusted no one for 63 years. "We close it back up for now," she said. Lily's expression moved through several things quickly. Clara watched her daughter process the instruction, process the logic behind it, arrive at the same place. "Okay," Lily said. Clara repacked the items she had removed, wrapping them as carefully as they'd been wrapped before, replacing them in their positions in the vault. She lowered the lid and heard the lock re-engage when she turned the key in the opposite direction. She covered the lid again with the dirt she had brushed away, pressing it back into place with her palms until the surface looked as it had when she'd first seen it. Not quite identical. The soil was looser now, the compression undone, but close enough. She scattered a handful of loose dirt over the surface for good measure. Then she stood, put the key in the inside pocket of her jacket, and looked at the closed cellar door above them. "We need to go to town," she said. "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." Calder Falls was 14 miles east on the county road, a distance that took 22 minutes in the Honda, which was moving better than it had the previous day now that its engine had fully warmed to the demands of the terrain. The town was small in the way that rural Midwestern towns were small, not tucked or quaint, but simply reduced, as though it had once been larger and then lost the reasons to be larger and had settled at this size as a kind of equilibrium. A gas station at the east end of the main street. A diner with a hand-lettered sign. A farm co-op whose parking lot held 3 pickup trucks and an ancient flatbed. A hardware store. A post office the size of a large closet. A building that had once been a bank and now sold antiques. That last one was what Clara was looking for. The sign above the door read Calder Antiques and Estate Sales, and the window display contained the kind of eclectic accumulation that came from decades of buying whatever the region produced when families cleaned out houses and settled estates. Old farm equipment alongside pressed glass, military patches behind framed needlework, a collection of pocket watches arranged on a velvet tray in the front corner. A bell above the door announced them. The man behind the counter looked up from a set of account books with the unhurried attention of someone who was not accustomed to strangers walking in on a Thursday morning. He was in his late 60s, compact and deliberate in the way of people who had spent their lives working with their hands, with a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work before he'd apparently moved indoors. His name, she would learn in the next 5 minutes, was Roy Buell. He had run this shop for 31 years after retiring from a career as an estate appraiser for the county, and he had seen, over those 31 years, most of what the surrounding region produced when old families let things go. He had not seen everything, it turned out. Clara showed him the gold coin first, the one she had rewrapped and brought in her jacket pocket, along with Harlan Greer's letter and the property receipt showing her legal ownership. She did not tell him about the vault. She said only that she had recently acquired a property on rural Route 7 and found some items she needed help evaluating. Roy Buell looked at the coin for a very long time. He turned it over. He produced a loop from his shirt pocket and examined both faces. He set it on his scale and wrote down the weight. He looked at the date, looked at the mint mark, looked at the condition of the surfaces. Then he set it on the counter and looked at Clara with the expression of someone recalibrating what kind of day they are having. 1907, he said. St. Gaudens Double Eagle. High relief. He paused. Do you know what that is? Gold coin. It's one of the most sought coins in American numismatics. The 1907 high relief was the first year of the St. Gaudens design, and the only year they minted the high relief version in quantity before they changed the dies because the relief was too deep to stack efficiently. Mint produced about 12,000. He paused again. That's not a lot. Combined with the condition of this piece, which is extraordinary for a coin that's been in storage rather than a controlled environment, this coin alone, in the current market, would bring somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 at auction. Clara looked at the coin on the counter. I have more than one, she said. Roy Buell looked at her very carefully. Then he looked at Lily, who was standing beside Clara examining a display case of antique pocket watches with apparent interest. Then he looked back at Clara. How many more than one, he said. She had counted them, in the oilcloth wrapping, before she put them back in the vault. She had not been certain of the count in the moment, working by flashlight in the cold, but she had been fairly sure. I think about 40, she said. Roy Buell sat down on his stool. She told him the rest of it, carefully, with the document in front of them and the property receipt beside it, establishing at each step the chain of legal ownership before she described what the chain of legal ownership had led to. The letter from Harlan Greer, the list of contents, the gold and silver and mineral specimens, and the paper wealth. She did not tell him the total extent of what she had seen in the vault. She described enough. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, You need someone considerably beyond my scope. But I know who you need. He picked up the phone behind the counter and made 2 calls while Clara and Lily sat in the pair of mismatched chairs near the door that Roy had pointed them toward. The first call was short, 3 minutes, and from the tone of it, seemed to be to someone he was accustomed to calling. The second call was longer, lower-voiced, and at one point he turned slightly away from them in a way that was not secretive exactly, but was careful. When he hung up and came back to the counter, he looked at Clara with an expression that combined professional composure with something she recognized as suppressed excitement, the controlled effect of a man who was very interested in what was happening and was choosing not to show all of that interest at once. There's a firm in St. Louis, he said. They handle estate appraisals for major collections, metals, numismatics, mineral specimens, historical securities. Full service. One of the partners has handled some of the larger estate discoveries in this part of the country over the past 20 years. He paused. She can be here in 3 days. 3 days, Clara repeated. She has a full schedule. This is a favor to me. He met Clara's eyes. Based on what you've described, and based on that coin, she'll rearrange the schedule. Clara thought about 3 days of sitting on a farmhouse with no utilities and no food and $141 between her and having to leave. She thought about Lily's amber eyes and the flashlight and the red sweatshirt with the fraying cuffs and the sleeping bags on the floor. What do I do in the meantime? She asked. Roy Buell reached under the counter and came up with a yellow legal pad. First, you make a complete inventory of everything in that vault. Photographs if you can. Detailed descriptions. Every item listed with its approximate dimensions and weight if possible. He picked up a pen and slid it across the counter with the legal pad. Second, you don't tell anyone else about this. Not yet. Not until you understand what you have. And third, he looked over her shoulder at the back of the shop, at a door she hadn't noticed. Third, if you don't have a place to stay that's weatherproofed, I've got a camper in the lot behind this building that's been sitting empty since my daughter's family used it 2 summers ago. Propane heat, running water off the tank. You can use it until the appraiser gets here. Clara looked at him for a moment, at his steady, weathered face, at the way he had said this without making it sound like charity, just a practical solution to a practical problem. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Roy thought about this. "Because I've worked in this county for 31 years, and I've watched what happens when people find things they don't understand and don't have the right support around them. They get taken from." He glanced at Lily, then back at Clara. "That coin is worth 6 figures in the right room. You don't want to be in the wrong room." She accepted the offer of the camper. The 3 days passed in a way that was simultaneously very slow and very dense. Clara spent the first morning back at the vault, doing exactly what Roy had recommended, working methodically from one end of the vault's contents to the other, lifting each wrapped and boxed item, noting its dimensions and estimated weight, and any visible characteristics in the borrowed legal pad, rewrapping and replacing each item before moving to the next. She took photographs with her phone until the battery died, then charged it in the camper and came back and took more. The inventory took all of the first day and most of the second. She filled 11 pages of the legal pad. Lily sat at the edge of the vault opening and managed the flashlight and read the descriptions back to Clara when she asked. And when she wasn't reading, she was drawing in her sketchbook, making careful renderings of individual items, the faces on the gold coins, the crystal structure of the mineral specimens, the printed surfaces of the bond certificates. Because the paper wealth was the part Clara had least context for, and it turned out to be the most extensive component of the vault's contents. Harlan Greer had been a thorough man. The wooden boxes that occupied the back third of the vault, which Clara had initially assumed contained more metals or specimens, were packed instead with documents. Bonds, as advertised, some issued by the federal government, some by state governments, some by private entities in the mining industry. Share certificates in companies whose names she didn't recognize, but which Roy, when she described them that evening, told her had been mining concerns operating in Missouri and the surrounding states in the late 1800s and early 1900s, some of which had been acquired by larger companies over the following decades and whose shares might or might not retain value depending on the specific corporate history of each acquisition. Mineral rights deeds. Survey certificates. A collection of what appeared to be private purchase agreements written in legal language she struggled to parse, each relating to specific parcels of land in the county. And then, at the very bottom of the last wooden box, wrapped separately from everything else in a piece of oilcloth that had been sealed at its edges with wax, a portfolio of documents in a different hand from everything else, older paper, different ink, that turned out to be the original mining survey records for a 60-acre claim staked in 1874 by a company whose successor corporation, she would later learn, was a subsidiary of an energy conglomerate that had spent the past 20 years looking for exactly these documents because without them, a disputed mineral rights claim that the conglomerate valued at several $100 million could not be settled. She didn't know that yet. She just put it with the rest of the inventory and wrote, "Survey portfolio, approximately 40 pages, original condition, 1874 dates visible." On the second evening, Roy Buell called his contact in St. Louis again to describe what Clara had inventoried and to give the preliminary count. Clara sat in the camper and listened to the muffled conversation through the thin wall, watching Lily eat soup at the small table, and she tried to prepare herself for the possibility that the appraiser would arrive and the numbers would be smaller than Roy's reaction to the coin had implied, that there would be explanations for why the face value of everything in that vault was less than it appeared. She had lived in the aftermath of enough collapsed expectations to know how quickly hope could become its own kind of liability. The appraiser arrived on the morning of the third day, driving a silver sedan that was visibly out of place on rural Route 7, its clean paint and low clearance navigating the track with the uncomfortable precision of something built for highways. Her name was Margaret Calloway, and she was 63 years old and had the particular authority of someone who had spent 4 decades being the most knowledgeable person in most rooms she entered and had stopped finding it remarkable. She shook Clara's hand at the farmhouse with a firm grip and looked at the building behind her with a practiced appraiser's eye. "I drove past this property 12 years ago," she said, "on a job in the county. Something made me look at it." She paused. "I should have stopped." She spent the first hour with the inventory pages Clara had prepared, reading them at the kitchen table with the silence of someone processing information rather than performing the act of reading. Twice she asked a question. Once about the specific dimensions of the gold bar. Once about the condition of the paper on the bond certificates. Clara answered both. Then Margaret Calloway put on her work gloves and went down into the cellar. She was down there for 4 hours. Clara sat on the back porch steps with Lily and did not go down. She had been asked to wait. Roy had come out from town and sat with them in a folding chair he'd brought from the shop, and the three of them sat in the cold October sun and talked about things that had nothing to do with the vault. Roy talked about the county's history, about the mining operations in the 1870s and 1880s, about the families who had come and gone, about the way the land changed hands and changed purposes and changed back again across generations. Lily listened and asked questions with the precision of a child who genuinely wanted to understand rather than simply pass the time. At one point, Roy looked at Clara. "You're very calm," he said. "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm waiting." When Margaret Calloway came back up the cellar steps, she was carrying the legal pad and her own notebook, and her gloves were dark with the kind of careful handling that left its own marks. She sat down on the porch steps beside Clara and looked out at the field for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you is preliminary. Final valuation requires laboratory analysis of the mineral specimens, formal numismatic grading, full document authentication for the paper securities. None of that can be done today." "I understand." Margaret looked at her notebook. The gold coins. 42 pieces. A mixed collection, mostly St. Gaudens double eagles, a smaller number of Liberty head eagles, and 6 pieces that I believe are pre-Civil War gold pieces that would be of significant collector interest. Conservative preliminary estimate, assuming average condition grade across the collection, $8 to $12 million. Clara did not move. The gold bullion. For bars of varying size. Based on current spot price and the apparent purity from the markings I was able to read, and I'll need laboratory assay to confirm, approximately $1.4 million at current markets. Lily had stopped drawing. The silver. 12 sterling pieces, flatware and serving items, several of significant age and maker's mark quality. Preliminary range, 40 to 80,000. Roy Buell was very still in his folding chair. The mineral specimens. This is where the preliminary numbers become harder to pin down because the market for exceptional specimens is thin and volatile. But I have to tell you that the collection in that vault is not ordinary. What you have are quartz specimens with native gold inclusions of a quality and size that I have not seen outside of museum collections. There are 14 specimens in total, based on comparable sales at major auction houses over the past decade. And being conservative, I would place the collection range at $7 to $20 million, and that range is genuinely wide because pieces like this set their own market. She paused. She looked at her notebook. The paper securities. I cannot give you reliable preliminary numbers on those because they require individual document authentication and corporate history research. Some may be worthless. Some of the mining company shares may have successor value that requires legal research to establish. But I want to flag the survey portfolio separately because I believe I recognize what it is. She looked at Clara. If those are what I believe they are, the original 1874 survey and claim records for the Greer Halcombe stake in the Eastern County Mineral Corridor, they are not historical artifacts. They are active legal documents with direct bearing on a mineral rights dispute that has been in federal court for 11 years. I would need to confirm with a resources attorney, but the practical value of those documents to the parties involved in that litigation is potentially very large, considerably larger than the physical collection. The fields were very quiet. The sky was very blue. Clara said, "How large?" Margaret Calloway looked at her with the steady eyes of a professional who was accustomed to delivering large numbers without inflating the moment and without deflating it either. "I spoke to a colleague this morning before I drove out here," she said. "Based on the information Roy gave me from your inventory, he had already identified the corporate history." She paused. "If the documents authenticate as original and the claim is established, the mineral rights in question are currently valued in the active litigation at $400 million. The survey records are the missing chain of title that neither party has been able to produce. Whoever holds them and can establish legitimate provenance has an extraordinary position." Clara heard a sound and realized it was Lily, who had set her sketchbook down and was sitting with both hands pressed flat to the porch boards on either side of her, staring at the field with an expression Clara had never seen on her daughter's face before. Roy said, very quietly, "Lord." Clara looked at Margaret Calloway. "So what you're telling me, what I'm telling you, very preliminarily, is that the total value of what is in that vault likely falls between $400 million and $460 million, depending on authentication outcomes and market conditions at the time of disposition." She said it plainly, without drama, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. The physical collection is significant. The mineral rights documents are extraordinary. The number went into Clara like a key going into a lock. Not explosive, not unreal. Something turning inside her, a sequence of internal movements, things releasing from positions they had held for a very long time. $455 million. Her $300. She sat on the back porch steps of a house she had bought at a county tax auction 11 days after she began sleeping in her car, and she looked at the field that Harlan Greer had walked across for 40 years keeping his secret, and she felt the October sun on her face, and she did not cry. She sat very still, and she breathed, and she let the number exist. Lily's hand found hers on the porch step and gripped it. Clara gripped back. Margaret Calloway was speaking again, practical and precise, about next steps, about engaging a resources attorney and a numismatic grading firm, and a geological laboratory for the specimens, and a securities historian for the corporate paper trail, about establishing an authenticated chain of title for the vault and its contents that would withstand any future legal challenge, about the timeline and the process and the professional team that Clara would need before a single item in that vault changed hands. Clara heard all of it. She retained all of it. She was a project manager by training and by instinct, and the practical sequence of what needed to happen was already forming in her mind with the clean logic of a project that had a start date and a set of deliverables and a team that needed assembling. She had done this before, with corporate logistics across time zones, with deadlines and stakeholders and competing interests. She could do this, but that was not the part of her mind that was fully engaged in this moment. The part that was fully engaged was the part that was sitting with 11 days of car sleeping and $45,000 of debt, and the way Dana's voice had sounded on the phone when she said you're going to spend your last $300 on a condemned house. The part that was sitting with Emma's fraying red sweatshirt cuffs and the powdered milk and the day-old bread and the folded map from the county board and the way the auctioneer's voice had gone flat when no one else raised a hand. The part that was sitting with her daughter's hand in hers on the back porch of a farmhouse that had waited 63 years and $300 to be found. Clara squeezed Lily's hand once and released it. "When can we start?" she said. Margaret was already reaching for her phone. The days that followed moved at a pace that Clara had not experienced since the most pressured phases of her project management career, when multiple work streams converged and the margin for error collapsed, and the only path forward was to be absolutely systematic about everything all at once. Margaret Calloway's firm operated with the efficiency of an organization accustomed to moving quickly around significant finds, because significant finds attracted attention from multiple directions, and the first priority was always establishing the legal framework before that attention arrived. An attorney named James Whitfield drove out from Kansas City 3 days after Margaret's visit. He was a mineral rights specialist with a secondary practice in estate law, and he spent his first morning at the farmhouse reviewing Harlan Greer's letter, Clara's deed, the county auction receipt, and the survey portfolio, which had been photographed but not yet moved from the vault. He emerged from the cellar with the photographs and the look of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and had just had a genuinely unusual morning. "The provenance chain is solid," he said, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop and Clara's inventory sheets. "Your deed from the county establishes clear ownership of the property and all permanent fixtures, which under Missouri estate law includes sealed storage structures on the property. The letter from Greer functions as a testamentary document transferring personal property to the legal holder of the property deed." He paused. Someone competent drafted that letter's legal logic, even if Greer wasn't trained as a lawyer. He understood what he was doing. He had 40 years to think about it, Clara said. "The mineral rights survey is the significant piece. There's a case. You may not know about it. It's been in federal court without much public attention. involving the Montrose Energy Corporation and a consortium of landowners in this county over the mineral rights to a 2,000-acre corridor of land. The original claim records from the 1874 staking were never produced by either party because neither party had them. The case has been deadlocked for 11 years. He looked at her. The survey portfolio you found is the original. I'm 90% confident of that from the photographs. If the authentication confirms it, you hold the document that resolves the dispute. He paused. Montrose will want to acquire those rights from you. So will the landowner consortium. You are in an extraordinary negotiating position. Clara thought about Roy Buell's warning, about being in the right room, about what happened to people who didn't have the right support around them. Who represents me? She asked. Whitfield opened his laptop. Right now I do. With your permission, I'll need to bring in a partner from our Mineral Rights Division who has history with the Montrose case, but the representation begins now if you want it. What are your fees? Contingency on the mineral rights negotiation. Standard percentage of settlement. No upfront cost. She agreed. By the end of the first week, the farmhouse had become a working site. A generator from Roy's hardware supplier ran power to the work lights and laptop chargers. A portable propane heater in the kitchen made the room livable as the October nights dropped further. The vault had been formally documented by Margaret Calloway's team, each item photographed under controlled conditions and cataloged against Clara's handwritten inventory, the catalog numbering into the hundreds of individual objects. Clara called her sister on the 8th day after the appraisal visit. Dana answered on the second ring with the slightly braced quality of a person who expected the call to require something from her. I need to tell you something, Clara said. She told her. Not everything. Not the numbers, because Whitfield had counseled against discussing specific figures with anyone outside the professional team until the formal appraisal was complete and the mineral rights negotiations had at least reached initial contact. But she told Dana about the vault, about Harlan Greer's letter, about the gold and the mineral specimens and the survey documents and what Margaret Calloway had said in general terms. Dana was silent for a long time. Then she said, Clara, I know. The $300 house. The $300 house. Another silence. Mama's going to completely lose her mind, Dana said. Clara sat on the front porch in the October cold and looked out at the track that led back to the county road, at the empty fields going gold in the afternoon light, at the barn with its collapsed end and its standing end, and the way the whole thing looked like something that had decided to stay despite every argument against it. Call her for me, Clara said. Tell her I'm okay. Tell her we have a house now. Dana said she would. Then, in a different register, quieter, I'm sorry I told you it was a bad idea. It was a reasonable thing to say. It was a scared thing to say. I was scared for you. Clara thought about the county tax auction board in the laundromat, the bright orange paper, the $1,200 in back taxes owed against a property no one had wanted for 50 years. She thought about the brass key in her hand and the click of the lock and the cold air rising from the open vault. I know, she said. The formal appraisal report from Margaret Calloway's firm arrived at the end of the third week in a document that ran to 140 pages and whose executive summary, in the first paragraph of its first page, stated that the total assessed value of the physical collection was in the range of $17 to $23 million, pending final laboratory analyses of certain specimens, and that the mineral survey portfolio, in the opinion of the resources attorney retained for assessment, had a litigation value that the firm estimated conservatively at $430 million subject to negotiation. $453 million. Approximately. Clara read the executive summary 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time, this time aloud, in the kitchen of the farmhouse with Lily sitting across the table from her. She read slowly, not because the language was difficult, but because she wanted Lily to hear every word and understand that what was being read was real, was documented, was authenticated by professionals whose job it was to be accurate. When she finished, Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, does this mean we can stay? Clara looked around the kitchen, at the iron bracket where the stove had been, at the calendar on the wall, at the window with its grime-hazed glass that the October sun was working through anyway, laying a stripe of pale light across the table between them. Yeah, she said, we can stay. But staying was going to require a different kind of fight than the one she'd already won. The mineral rights negotiations had begun, and they were not simple, and the parties on the other side of the table were not small. And word, as Roy had predicted and Whitfield had warned, was already beginning to move in the way that word moved in a region where everyone knew everyone, and where a woman arriving from nowhere to buy a county tax property and then suddenly retaining a Kansas City mineral rights attorney was a combination of facts that people noticed. The first car she didn't recognize came down the track on the 22nd day. A truck, actually, newer and clean and bearing a real estate company's logo on the door. The man who got out was wearing the kind of clothes that communicated money without being ostentatious about it, pressed jeans and a good coat. And he came up the porch steps with the relaxed authority of someone who had never considered that he might not be welcome. He introduced himself as a representative of a development firm based in Jefferson City. He had heard, he said, that the property on rural Route 7 might be coming to market. He wanted to discuss a purchase offer. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at him. She thought about Harlan Greer and the men who had asked questions he didn't want to answer, the visit that had sent him down to the cellar with a bucket of packed earth and a brass key. She thought about what Roy had said. I've watched what happens when people find things they don't understand and don't have the right support around them. She had the right support around her now. She had Whitfield and Margaret Calloway and Roy Buell, and, as of 3 days ago, a second attorney Whitfield had brought in from his firm's mineral rights division who had spent 11 years watching the Montrose case sit in deadlock and had, on hearing about the survey portfolio, described the situation in terms she wasn't going to repeat in front of Lily. The development representative was still talking. Clara waited until he paused. The property is not for sale, she said. He smiled with the practiced patience of a man who had heard that before. We're prepared to be very competitive on price. This land has been on the county tax rolls as vacant for decades. We could offer you a fair. The property is not for sale, she said again. And the land is not vacant. We live here. His smile adjusted slightly. I understand you're just settling in. But if you take a moment to consider your circumstances, I know my circumstances, Clara said. I've known them for a long time. She closed the door. Lily appeared from the kitchen doorway. She had heard. Who was that, she said. Someone who wants what we have. Lily considered this. Are there going to be more of them? Clara turned from the door and looked at her daughter, at the fraying cuffs, at the amber eyes that missed nothing. Yes, she said. But we know what we have now. That's the difference. She went to find her phone and called James Whitfield, because if the development company had found rural Route 7 already, the news was further along than Whitfield had anticipated, and there were conversations that needed to happen faster than the current timeline allowed. Outside, through the kitchen window, the October fields stretched out under a sky gone gray with the particular gray of late afternoon in the Midwest in autumn, flat and wide and full of weather that was coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. The farmhouse stood around Clara and Lily the way it had stood around the October cold and the summer heat and the 50 years of no one, patient and solid and built to last. $300. $455 million. The math was not reasonable. The math was not the kind of thing that happened to people who had been sleeping in their car 11 days before. The math was not the kind of thing that corresponded to any prior experience of how the world worked or distributed its outcomes. But the vault existed. The documents existed. The gold existed. The 80-year-old letter from a man named Harlan Greer existed, written in neat, careful handwriting by someone who had spent 40 years waiting for the right person to come down those stone stairs and turn that brass key. Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched the last of the afternoon light move across the fields and thought about what it meant to be the right person. Not the deserving person, not the exceptional person, not the person who had earned this through some quality that elevated her above others in similar circumstances. Just the person who had shown up. The person who had been standing in front of the laundromat bulletin board on the right morning in the right desperation with $300 and nowhere else to put them. The person whose 8-year-old daughter had dreamed about light coming from beneath the cellar door. From upstairs, she heard Lily moving around in the room they had claimed as theirs, the front bedroom with the window that looked out over the porch. She heard the familiar sounds of Lily settling in for the evening, the sketchbook pages turning, the quiet hum that meant she was drawing something that required concentration. The sounds of a child in a house that belonged to them. Clara turned from the window and began making a list. It started as a practical list. The things that needed doing on the property before winter made them impossible. The porch boards that needed replacing. The chimney that needed an inspection before the fireplace could be safely used. The windows that needed reglazing, or at minimum, the gaps in the frames that needed sealing before the November cold arrived in force. The kitchen needed a functional range. The house needed water, which meant calling the well company Roy had recommended to test and potentially rehabilitate the old well that Harlan Greer would have used. All of this was possible now. All of this was a list she could address in order. But the list kept going. She kept writing. The debt, $45,000 owed across credit cards and legal fees, and the medical bill from Emma's pneumonia, the weight she had been carrying for 2 years, the number she had done her best not to think about directly, because thinking about it directly was the kind of thing that made her sit still in the dark for too long. That number, which had felt like a wall she could not see around, was now simply a line item. She wrote it down, and then, beside it, she wrote paid. She had not written paid next to anything in a very long time. She wrote down the school. Lily's school, the one they had left behind in Columbus when the apartment became untenable, the one Lily had attended since first grade with the teacher she loved and the 3 friends she had described in careful detail during the car nights. The way children cataloged the specific things they missed when missing was the only available relationship to them. Lily had not complained about the school she was missing. Lily had not complained about any of it. She had been the kind of 8-year-old that Clara was not sure she deserved, and the understanding of that hit her now. Writing the word school on the yellow legal pad at the kitchen table of a house that was hers, with a number behind her that changed every calculation she had ever made. She was not going back to Columbus. She understood that clearly, the way she understood other things that had settled into certainty over the past 3 weeks. This was the place. This land. This house. This specific 16 acres in Missouri with its stone-stepped cellar and its sealed vault and its 63-year silence that had waited for a woman and a child who had nowhere else to go. But Lily deserved a good school. A good school was achievable now. Many things were achievable now that had not been achievable before. She wrote them down. She was still writing when she heard gravel crunching in the track outside, the sound of a vehicle slowing. Not the development company's truck. It was gone. Something else. She looked at the time on her phone. Nearly 7 in the evening. Dark already. The fields outside the window invisible except for the pale shape of the barn. Headlights swept the kitchen wall as a car pulled into the clearing. She went to the front door and looked out. It was Roy Buell's pickup. He climbed out carrying a cardboard box that made a sound like cans when he set it on the bottom porch step to free a hand for the railing. And he came up onto the porch with the unhurried deliberateness of a man making a social call rather than an urgent one. "Thought you might need supplies," he said, nodding at the box. "Brought enough for a week. Canned goods, coffee, some bread from the bakery before they closed. Couple of those hand warmers that go in your jacket pockets." Clara looked at the box, then at Roy. "You drove 14 miles to bring us groceries," she said. "I was also coming to tell you something." He looked at the darkness beyond. The porch railing. "It's out. The news, or some version of it. I don't know how it moved. These things always move, in a county this size. But there are people in town talking. Not the numbers, not the details, but the shape of it. Woman buys the Greer place for tax value, brings in outside appraisers, retains a lawyer from Kansas City." Clara absorbed this. "How are people talking about it?" she asked. Roy considered the question carefully, in the way of someone who had lived in a small community for 31 years and understood that how was a different kind of information than what. "Mixed," he said. "Some curious, some skeptical. There are people in town who believe the Greer place is cursed, for lack of a better word. That's an old story, goes back to when Harlan was alive and kept to himself the way he did. There are people who think anyone who bought it is either foolish or unfortunate." He paused. "And there are people who are paying attention in a more interested way. The development company that came out today, they're not the only firm that's been aware of this land." "How many?" "2 that I know of. One connected to a Kansas City real estate group that's been buying up rural properties in this county for the past 6 years. One that I believe has connections to Montrose Energy, though that one's less obvious." He looked at her steadily. "Whitfield needs to know about both." She already had her phone out. Roy picked up his box and carried it inside without being invited, which Clara had noticed was his way of not making things into moments that required negotiation. He set it on the kitchen counter and began taking things out with the systematic efficiency of a man who packed boxes the way he used them. One other thing, he said, setting a bag of coffee beside the kerosene lamp Clara had cleaned and refilled from a can she'd found in the barn. What? Your sister called me. Clara stopped. She called the shop, Roy said. This afternoon, while you were on the phone with Whitfield the first time. I don't know how she got my number. She said she's been trying to reach you and keeps getting voicemail. My phone's been busy. I know. He set a box of crackers on the shelf with the deliberate care of someone reaching the point of what he had come to say. She sounded scared. Not about the money. About you being out here alone with Lily. He paused. She wanted me to tell you that she would like to come. Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment. She thought about Dana's voice on the phone. The scared thing to say. She thought about the version of herself who had made that call to Dana from the parking lot in Columbus, holding a photograph of an orange bulletin board notice and a brass key to a farmhouse she hadn't seen yet. She thought about all the reasonable things Dana had said, all the ways in which her sister's skepticism had been motivated by nothing more malicious than fear. Tell her to come, Clara said. Roy nodded once. He finished unpacking the box and said goodnight and drove back down the track into the dark, his tail lights moving away through the fields the way the first car's lights had moved in the inspiration story Lily had made her read aloud 6 weeks ago from her library book, except that this was not a story and the lights were not going toward anything uncertain. Clara went upstairs. Lily was at the window, not drawing, just looking out at the dark field. She had heard Roy's truck. She turned when Clara came in. Mrs. Calloway called while you were downstairs, she said. She left a message. She said the first lab results on the mineral specimens came back, and she wants to talk tomorrow morning. Okay. Lily turned back to the window. After a moment, she said, Roy brought food. He did. That was kind. He's kind, Clara said. Another silence. Comfortable in the way silences could be when you were warm and had food and were inside a structure that was keeping the cold on the outside where it belonged. Mom, Lily said. Yeah. I want to fix the porch before Aunt Dana comes. Clara looked at her daughter in the dark window, at the reflected outline of her face, at the fraying cuffs she could just make out in the low light. The porch, she said. The boards are soft in that one spot. She'll step on it and fall through. Or she'll think it's dangerous and say we should leave. Lily turned away from the window. I want it fixed before she gets here so she can't use it as a reason to say we should go somewhere else. Clara looked at her daughter for a long moment, at the 8-year-old girl who had slept in a car for 11 days and carried her own bear in her own backpack, and asked a hardware store owner if she could document a construction project, and had dreamed about light coming from beneath a cellar door and had not wavered once in her conviction that they were in the right place. We'll fix the porch, Clara said. Lily nodded. Good. She climbed into her sleeping bag and reached for her sketchbook. Clara stood in the doorway of the bedroom and listened to the house breathe around them, the timbers settling with the cold, the wind at the window frames, the patient old sounds of a structure that had been doing this for a very long time and had not stopped. Below them, under the kitchen floor, through the cold dirt and the stone steps and the cellar floor, the vault sat sealed and documented and legally established, its contents cataloged against the day when the right people in the right rooms with the right authorizations would open the conversations that would turn the numbers on Margaret Calloway's 140-page report into something real and transferable and final. That day was coming. There were people who didn't want it to come, and they were already moving, already calculating, already sending representatives down unpaved tracks to knock on doors in the early dark. That part was not over, but neither was this. Clara went back downstairs and finished her list. Dana arrived on a Saturday with 2 suitcases and the expression of someone who had spent the entire 4-hour drive steeling themselves for whatever condition they expected to find. She pulled in off the track in a rental car that was visibly wrong for the terrain, low and clean, and she sat in it for a moment before getting out, looking through the windshield at the farmhouse with an expression Clara watched from the porch and couldn't fully read. The porch boards had been replaced 2 days earlier. Roy had brought the lumber from his hardware supplier, and he and Clara had pulled the softboards and set new ones with the methodical cooperation of 2 people who had no shared history of doing this, but had enough common sense between them to figure it out. The new boards were raw pine, pale against the weathered gray of the old ones, and they would need painting or sealing before spring. But they were solid and they were safe, and when Dana set her foot on the first step and it held without complaint, Clara felt a specific quiet satisfaction. Dana came up the steps and stood on the porch and looked at her sister and then past her at the house and the fields and the barn. "It's real," she said. "It's real. I drove past 3 different county roads before I found the right track." "I know. I did the same thing." Dana looked at her for a long moment. She was 2 years older than Clara, which had always meant something between them, had always carried a weight of responsibility that sometimes felt like care and sometimes felt like judgment, and was almost always both at once. She had their mother's eyes and their father's stubbornness and a particular quality of competence that expressed itself as efficiency in good times and as control in hard ones. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. "I should have come sooner," she said. "You didn't know, not about the money. Before that." She said it plainly, without drama, the way she had learned to say things she had thought about too long to still need softening. "When you were in the car. I should have come." Clara stood with that for a moment. "You offered me Mom's couch. I offered you a relay to someone else's couch. That's different, and I knew it was different." Dana picked up one of her suitcases. "Are you going to let me in, or are we going to do this on the porch?" Clara stepped aside. Dana walked through the front door and into the house and stood in the front room with the stone fireplace and the kerosene lamp on the table and the wide plank floor and the faint, ancient smell that Clara had long since stopped consciously noticing and Dana now noticed very much. She stood still with her suitcase handle in her hand and looked at all of it. "Clara," she said. "I know. This is—" She stopped. Started again. "It's a house. It is. A real house. With walls and a roof and a fireplace. The chimney passed inspection last week. We've been using it." Dana turned to look at her sister with the specific expression of someone revising a set of assumptions they had been operating on for weeks. "I thought it was a ruin. I thought you were being brave about a ruin. Some of it needed work. Some of it," Dana repeated, in the tone she used when she was deciding whether to press a point. Lily came downstairs at that moment, appearing in the entrance to the front room with her sketchbook under her arm, and Dana's expression changed entirely. "Aunt Dana." Lily set down her sketchbook and accepted the hug that Dana crossed the room to give her with the polite but genuine affection of a child who understood that her aunt loved her and also that adults were sometimes complicated in ways that required patience. She submitted to the hug and then pulled back to arm's length and looked at her aunt with assessment. "You look scared," she said. "I was worried." "We're okay." Lily said it with the matter-of-fact certainty that had characterized her since the first morning at the farmhouse, the tone of someone reporting a confirmed fact rather than attempting reassurance. "We were okay before, and now we're more okay. Do you want to see the house?" Dana looked over Lily's head at Clara with the face of a woman being instructed by an 8-year-old in the nature of her own anxiety. "I'd love to," she said. Lily took her on the full tour, which she had now given 4 times to various people connected to the appraisal and legal process, and which she had refined into something between a documentary narration and a piece of performance, a presentation of facts delivered with the authority of someone who had discovered them personally and considered herself their primary custodian. She took Dana through the front room and the kitchen and the second floor, explaining the structure and the history and the specific technical details that she had absorbed from listening to Margaret Calloway and Roy and Whitfield and the chimney inspector, and then she took her out to the back porch and pointed at the cellar doors. "That's where it is," Lily said. Dana looked at the cellar doors. "At the flat ground, the stone surround, the iron ring handle. All of it is down there. Most of it. Some of it went to St. Louis for testing." Dana was quiet for a moment, looking at the ordinary-looking wooden doors in the ordinary-looking ground. $45,000 of debt, she said, mostly to herself. "Paid," Clara said, from behind her. "As of Thursday." Dana turned. Whitfield arranged in advance against the physical collection. Just the coins and bullion, which are the most straightforwardly liquid assets. Enough to clear the debt, restore utilities to the property, and cover operating costs through the mineral rights negotiations. Clara paused. "It took 4 days to process. I paid the last bill Thursday morning." Dana looked at her in the October light, in the yard of the farmhouse that had been abandoned for 60 years and bought for $300, and her face did the thing that faces did when a long-held fear released all at once. Not dramatically, not with tears, just a sudden removal of something that had been held in the muscles and the jaw and the area around the eyes for long enough to feel like a structural feature. She sat down on the back porch step. Clara sat down beside her. They sat in silence for a while, the two of them, looking at the cellar doors and the fields beyond, and the barn with its one standing end and its one collapsed end. Lily had gone back inside to draw. "Mom's coming next week," Dana said. "I know. She called me. She cried on the phone when I told her about the house." Clara thought about her mother's voice on that first call, after the auction notice, the flat, careful practicality of a woman who had protected herself from hope for so long that protection had become indistinguishable from character. "Use your head," she had said. "Don't waste your time chasing fairy tales." She thought about what it cost to say that to your own child, and why a person might choose to pay that cost, and what it meant about the hopes you had given up on that you would choose to transmit, that giving up to someone who hadn't yet. "She was scared," Clara said. "She's always scared." "So am I." Clara looked at the cellar doors. "I was scared the whole time. I'm still scared." Dana looked at her sideways. "Then how did you?" "I was more scared of the alternative." Clara picked a dried stalk of grass from beside the step and turned it in her fingers. The alternative was certain. The car, the debt, no end to it. This was uncertain. But uncertain and certain bad are different things, even if they feel the same at 3 in the morning. Dana absorbed this. "I'm going to quote that at people," she said. "Please don't." The mineral rights negotiations had been moving for 2 weeks by the time Dana arrived, and they were not going gently. James Whitfield had made initial contact with both parties in the Montrose case, presenting the discovery of the survey portfolio and establishing Clara's legal position as holder of the documents, and the response from both sides had been swift in a way that confirmed what everyone around Clara had already said. This was not a dormant matter. These were parties who had been fighting over a significant sum of money for 11 years and who had just been told that a woman from Columbus, Ohio, had shown up in possession of the piece of paper that could end the fight. Montrose Energy's legal team arrived in Missouri with 9 attorneys. The landowner consortium's representation was smaller, but had been working the case longer and knew its specifics in a depth that the corporate team couldn't match on short notice. Whitfield's partner, a woman named Carla Osei, who had been following the Montrose case since its filing, sat at the table with Clara and managed the early meetings with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting 11 years for exactly this moment. Clara attended every session. She said very little in the early ones, which Osei had advised, letting the attorneys establish the framework, letting the parties make their opening positions clear, watching the room with the project manager's instinct for understanding where the resistance was and where the movement was and how the two were related. The resistance, on Montrose's side, was not about the authenticity of the documents. The laboratory had returned its analysis and the survey portfolio was definitively original, the chain of physical evidence clear and documented. Montrose's resistance was about valuation. Their position was that the mineral rights were worth less than the litigation had established, that the market conditions had shifted, that the extraction economics had changed. Osei's response to this, delivered with a calm that Clara found quietly thrilling, was to produce a second geological survey commissioned in the past month based on the original 1874 records, conducted by a firm with no connection to either party, which established that the mineral corridor contained reserves whose current valuation, based on present energy prices and extraction technology, was considerably higher than what either party had claimed in the original filing. The number on that report was $470 million. The room was quiet for a while after Osei read it. Montrose's lead attorney, a man named Crawford who wore his authority like a garment that had been tailored specifically to intimidate, looked across the table at Clara and said, "Miss Weston, I'd like to speak to you directly for a moment, if your counsel permits." Osei nodded. Crawford folded his hands on the table with the practiced composure of someone who had been in many rooms like this one. "You came into this situation, as I understand it, with almost no resources and no prior knowledge of what you'd found. You've been extremely well advised since. I want to offer you my personal respect for that, before I make you an offer that I would encourage you to consider carefully." Clara looked at him. He named a number. It was a large number, 8 figures, framed as a clean settlement that would avoid years of additional litigation and provide Clara with immediate certainty rather than the risk of a contested outcome. Clara looked at the number. She thought about $45,000 of debt. She thought about the things she had said to Dana on the porch step. Uncertain and certain bad are different things. She also thought about Harlan Greer. About 40 years of gathering and preserving and waiting. About the document he had written and sealed in wax and packed in chamois and placed at the bottom of the last box with the specific intention that whoever found it would understand what they were holding and what it was worth and would not be talked out of it by a man in a tailored suit. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I'll consider it with my attorneys." Crawford nodded, as though he had expected this. In the hallway afterward, Osei looked at Clara with an expression that mixed professional approval with something more personal. "You didn't blink," she said. "I've been practicing," Clara said. The negotiations took 6 more weeks. They moved through positions and counterpositions with the grinding deliberateness of processes involving large sums and parties who each believed they were right and were each partially correct and were each motivated by losses they could not afford. Clara attended when required and stayed away when not, understanding from her project management history that the worst thing you could do in a high-stakes negotiation was be present for the sessions where nothing moved, because nothing moving cost energy and she needed to conserve it. She spent the in-between time on the farmhouse. Roy sourced materials, and Clara learned to use them. She relearned things she had known abstractly that she now had to know physically, the difference between wood that would take paint and wood that wouldn't, the way a window frame seated against its sill, the specific sound a beam made when it was sound versus when it had softened from the inside in ways the surface didn't show. The chimney inspector had passed the fireplace, and they used it every evening now. The front room warm and orange-lit in a way that made the house feel inhabited in a way it hadn't been for 60 years. Lily enrolled at the county school in Calder Falls. It was small, smaller than her Columbus school, 1 classroom per grade, a gym that doubled as a cafeteria, a library with limited resources. It was also staffed by people who knew every student by name and who treated the arrival of a new student from Ohio as something that merited genuine attention rather than administrative processing. Lily came home from her first week with 4 new acquaintances and a very definite opinion about which one would become an actual friend, and she was right about that, as she was right about most things she assessed carefully. Dana stayed for 3 weeks. She helped with the house and the negotiations and the logistics of getting a family established in a rural property with no prior infrastructure. And she proved to be exactly as competent as she had always been in the ways that mattered, and exactly as controlling in the ways that sometimes created friction and entirely irreplaceable in the overall category of having another person present who loved both Clara and Lily and had no agenda beyond their welfare. On her last evening, she stood in the kitchen while Clara cooked on the new propane range and said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting." Clara kept stirring. "When you called me from that parking lot about the auction notice, my first thought, before I said anything out loud, my actual first thought was, she's going to do it." Dana paused. "I knew you were going to do it. And I knew it might work, not necessarily like this. I didn't imagine this. But I knew that if anyone was going to walk into an abandoned farmhouse with $300 and find something that changed everything, it was going to be you." She paused again. "And then I talked you out of it anyway. Because I was scared. Because I couldn't stand the thought of you being disappointed again." Clara said nothing. "I wanted to tell you that," Dana said. "Before I drove back." Clara set down the spoon and looked at her sister. "You didn't talk me out of it," she said. "Only because you didn't let me. No, because you couldn't. Because the thing I've understood since we were kids about the two of us is that you're the one who knows when something is right, and I'm the one who does it anyway. We need each other." She picked the spoon back up. "You're going to come back at Christmas." "Obviously," Dana said. Their mother came 10 days after Dana left, driving herself from Columbus in the Buick she had owned for 14 years and refused to replace on the grounds that it still ran. She arrived in the early afternoon on a Tuesday, pulling in off the track with the careful steering of someone who had not driven on unpaved roads in some time and was taking them seriously. Clara watched her get out of the car. Her mother was 71 years old and had the upright bearing of a woman who had decided at some point in her 40s that she would not allow herself to stoop, and had kept that decision through every subsequent decade. Her hair was white and cut short, and she wore practical clothing that announced no particular opinion about fashion. She stood beside the Buick and looked at the farmhouse for a long moment, the way both Clara and Dana had looked at it on their first visit, taking it in, calibrating it against what they had expected and what they were finding. Then she looked at Clara. Her face, which had contained itself for 40 years of practical living and the particular discipline of a woman who had raised children mostly alone after their father left and had learned not to invest in outcomes she couldn't control, did something that Clara had not seen it do since Clara was 8 years old. It cracked open, not into tears, not quite, but into something that was the material of tears, the raw underpinning of an emotion that the discipline had spent decades containing. It lasted only a moment. Her mother walked across the yard and held her, briefly and firmly, the hug of someone who was not accustomed to hugging but was choosing to do it right. Your grandmother would have done this, her mother said. The same thing. Walk into somewhere everyone said was worthless and find the thing everyone missed. Clara didn't ask which grandmother. She already knew. Her mother stayed for 2 weeks. She helped in the way she helped, practically and without fuss, cooking real meals and assessing structural issues with the eye of a woman who had owned property and maintained it and understood what things cost and what they meant. She sat with Lily in the evenings while Lily drew, and they talked in the easy way of a grandmother and grandchild who had not spent enough time together and were making up for it efficiently. On the third evening, sitting by the fire, her mother looked around the front room and said, "I told you not to do this." "You did. I thought I was protecting you." "I know you did." Her mother looked at the fire. "The coin in the parking lot," she said. It was an old family phrase, one Clara hadn't heard in years, something her grandmother had used for the moment you spotted the thing everyone else had walked past. The overlooked valuable. The dismissed possibility. Your grandmother was always finding the coin in the parking lot. I never had that instinct. I was always watching for the thing that was going to hurt me. She paused. I tried to teach you to watch for the thing that was going to hurt you. You kept me alive, Clara said. Being careful kept me alive. Being careful almost kept you in that car. The fire moved. And then being brave kept you out of it, her mother said. I don't know how you got both things. I had good examples, Clara said. Of both. Her mother looked at her. Then she looked at the fire again and didn't say anything else, which was her version of acceptance, and Clara had known her long enough to know that was what it was. The settlement arrived on a Thursday morning in November, a date that Clara would remember specifically and in detail for the rest of her life, not because the day was dramatic, but because it was quiet. She was in the kitchen when Osei called. Lily was at school. The fire in the front room had burned down to coals. The fields outside the window were bare and gray-brown under a sky that carried the specific weight of November in the Midwest, low and even and neither threatening nor promising. Osei said, "They settled." Clara said, "Tell me." The landowner consortium had agreed to purchase the mineral rights established by the survey documents for a sum of $412 million, to be paid to Clara Weston as the legal holder of the documents and thereby the holder of the mineral rights title. Montrose Energy, facing a case that had now turned definitively against them, had withdrawn their competing claim the previous evening and negotiated a separate extraction licensing agreement with the consortium that had nothing to do with Clara and was not her concern. The settlement was clean, the title was clear, and after Whitfield's contingency fee and Osei's fees and the various costs of the appraisal process, the net amount coming to Clara was $389 million. Plus the physical collection, which Margaret Calloway's firm would handle through appropriate channels over the coming months, a process expected to yield somewhere between 17 and 22 million additional. Total, when everything was done, something in the range of $410 million. Clara stood at the kitchen window and listened to Osei go through the administrative details of how the settlement would be processed and what the next steps were and what she needed to sign and when. She said yes at the appropriate intervals. She said thank you at the end, with a completeness of feeling that she hoped came through the phone adequately. Then she put the phone down on the counter and stood very still and let the number exist in the kitchen of the $300 farmhouse in Calder Falls, Missouri, on a gray November morning, with the fire coaling down in the next room and the bare fields outside and the cellar doors flat in the frozen ground between the house and the ruined barn. She thought about the county tax auction, the 11 bidders who hadn't raised their hands, the auctioneer's voice going flat, going once, going twice. She thought about the car, Lily's breathing in the dark. She thought about Harlan Greer, who had spent 40 years acquiring things that everyone else had failed to understand, who had sealed them in the dark and written his careful letter and waited, not knowing how long the wait would be or who would come. He had waited 63 years. He had waited for a woman with $300 and nowhere else to put them. He had waited for right person. She hoped she was worth the wait. Lily knew about the settlement before she got home from school, because Lily had her mother's instinct for the weight of things and came through the front door at 3:40 in the afternoon and looked at Clara standing by the fireplace and said, "It happened." Not a question. "It happened," Clara said. Lily set down her backpack. She sat down in the chair by the fire, the old wooden chair that had been in this room when they arrived, and that Lily had claimed as hers because she said it had been waiting for someone to sit in it. She folded her hands in her lap. "Are we going to stay?" she asked. The same question she had asked the morning after the vault, in the kitchen with the appraisal report between them on the table. "We're going to stay," Clara said. "We're going to fix the house properly. We're going to fix the barn. We're going to plant the south field next spring if you wanna." Lily looked at the fire. "Can we get a dog?" Clara thought about this. "Yes." Lily's smile came the way her smiles always came, slowly and from somewhere internal, not for display but genuine. The specific smile of a person who has received information that matches what they had hoped but hadn't said. "Good," she said. The formal authentication of the physical collection was completed in the first week of December, the laboratory and numismatic reports returning in sequence over several days like chapters of a story being released one at a time. The gold coins graded above the preliminary estimates in 2/3 of cases, including 3 pieces that the numismatic firm's lead grader described in his report with the specific, controlled restraint of a professional who had trained himself not to show excitement in written assessments as among the finest surviving examples of their type. The mineral specimens drew attention from 2 museum acquisition departments within a week of Margaret Calloway circulating the assessment within her professional network, and the subsequent discussion about which institution would ultimately receive them consumed considerable correspondence over the following months. The bond portfolio was largely, as Whitfield had cautioned, of historical rather than financial value. Several pieces were collectible as documents, which Margaret would handle. 2 of the state-issued bonds, however, had been redeemed by a successor institution in the 1960s without the original certificates ever being presented, a circumstance whose legal resolution took 3 more weeks and produced an additional $420,000 that surprised everyone, including Osei, who said she had never seen that particular resolution move so cleanly. Whitfield said, "This collection rewards attention at every level." Clara said, "It rewarded 60 years of attention before I got here." The town of Calder Falls processed the news over the following weeks in the way small towns processed significant things, through conversation that moved from the hardware store to the diner to the co-op and back, through a process of accumulation and revision that produced, over time, a community understanding that was more accurate than the early versions, but still simplified the thing it was trying to describe. The early versions had been skeptical. Clara heard about them through Roy, who heard everything and filtered it without editorializing, presenting what was being said with the neutral accuracy of a man who considered information a resource to be passed on rather than a judgment to be rendered. Some people said the lawyers had done the work and the money would be eaten up in fees. Some people said it would fall through, that these things always fell through. Some people said she was from Ohio and would be gone by spring, that outsiders always were. Dana called during the second week of November, after the settlement number was public enough in legal and professional circles that it had filtered into general conversation despite no formal announcement. She had been back in Columbus for 3 weeks by then, back at her job and her apartment and her life, and she called on a Sunday evening when Lily was already asleep. "I need to tell you what people are saying," Dana said. "What are they saying?" "At work. People who knew I had a sister going through a rough patch. They're saying things like she always knew and she had inside information about the property and the whole thing was too convenient to be luck." Dana paused. "One of my colleagues said you probably knew about the vault before you bought the place." Clara said nothing for a moment. "What do you say to them?" she asked. "I say my sister bought a condemned house for $300 and slept in her car for 11 days before she did it. And if that's inside information, it's the hardest earned inside information in the history of real estate." Dana paused. "And then I send them the auctioneer's receipt." Clara laughed. A real laugh, sudden and complete. "You have the auctioneer's receipt? I asked you to send it to me 3 weeks ago. I had a feeling I'd need it." Dana's voice had the dry satisfaction it carried when she was right about something she had prepared for. People need documentation. Give them documentation. Doubt doesn't survive paperwork. The auctioneer's receipt. $300. The date stamp from the county courthouse. The property address on rural Route 7. 200 words of bureaucratic language that together described a woman with almost nothing buying a thing that nobody wanted and finding in it something that nobody had thought to look for. It spread in the way things spread now, from Dana's direct circle outward through the particular networks that connected people who had known Clara during the good years and the hard years and the hardest years. The people from the medical group who had watched her lose the job, and the people from the neighborhood who had watched her lose the apartment, and the friends who had offered what they could, and the ones who had offered less than they could, and the one who had offered her couch, and then retracted it when her boyfriend returned. The receipt needed no commentary. It said what it said. Clara did not follow what people were saying in Columbus very closely. She had too much to do on rural Route 7 and in the conference rooms where the remaining legal work was resolving itself. And she had understood since the car sleeping days that the opinions of people who had not been in the car with her were not information she could afford to spend energy managing. But she heard enough to know that the tone had shifted, the way tones always shifted when circumstances shifted, from the patronizing concern of people who had believed they understood her situation to something less comfortable and less easily categorized. Some of the people who had doubted her called to say they were glad it had worked out. She thanked them sincerely, because she was old enough to know that calling required more courage than not calling, and that the calls were, in their own way, a form of the same thing she had done when she raised her hand at the auction, showing up when it would have been easier not to. Some of them didn't call, and she did not wait for those calls, because she had no time to wait. As the weeks passed and the settlement held and the fees were paid and Clara was still there, fixing the porch and planting cover crops in the south field, and appearing at the county school events and shopping at the co-op, and filling the Honda at the same gas station at the east end of the main street every 2 weeks, the skepticism gave way to something more complex and less uniform. There was a woman named Pat Granger who ran the bakery on Main Street, and who had been born in Calder Falls and had never lived anywhere else, and who tracked the health of the community with the vigilance of someone who understood that small places died when nobody was watching. She came into Roy's shop one afternoon when Clara was there picking up paint for the barn project, and she looked at Clara with the assessing gaze of a woman who had seen a lot of people come through and was deciding which category this one fell into. "You're staying," she said. It was not quite a question. "I'm staying," Clara said. Pat Granger looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at Roy. Then she said, "We need someone on the County Historical Preservation Board. It's been empty since Helene Marsh retired in the spring. Lot of old properties in this county, lot of stories. Most of them about to be lost." She paused. "Seems like you might have a relevant perspective." Clara thought about Harlan Greer and his 40 years and his sealed vault and his letter written for a future he couldn't see. She thought about the calendar stopped at September 1963. She thought about what it meant to be the person who paid attention to the thing everyone else had passed. "I'd be interested," she said. Roy, behind his counter, was very carefully not smiling. The development company's representative came back twice more in November. The first visit was a repeat of the first. An offer at a higher number, better dressed this time in language about partnership and community benefit. Clara stood on the solid new porch boards and told him the property was not for sale and thanked him for his time. The second visit was shorter, as though they had sent someone less senior, and the brevity of the visit itself communicated the message that this particular avenue had been assessed and closed. They did not come back a third time. The man from the Kansas City Real Estate Group sent a letter rather than a representative, which Clara thought showed either better judgment or less confidence. She forwarded it to Whitfield, who forwarded it to a file. In December, when the first serious snow came, Clara built a fire in the front room fireplace and sat with Lily and her mother, who had come back for the holidays, and Roy Buell, who had been persuaded to join them for dinner with the casual irresistibility of a man who had been eating alone for many years and found the invitation hard to decline. And they sat around the table that Clara had bought at an estate sale in the county, solid oak, large enough for more people than were currently in the house. And they ate a proper meal with food from the co-op and wine that Roy had brought and Lily's drawing of the farmhouse hanging on the wall where the 1963 calendar had been. Her mother looked at the drawing. She has your grandmother's eye, she said, to no one in particular. Which grandmother? Lily asked. Clara looked at her mother. Both of them, her mother said. Clara looked at the drawing. The farmhouse rendered in Lily's precise and affectionate hand. The narrow windows, the wide porch, the vine on the south wall that Clara had decided to leave rather than remove because it had been there for 50 years and had become structural in its own right and was, in its way, as much a part of the building as the wood and the stone. The cellar doors flat in the ground behind the kitchen, visible at the edge of the drawing's perspective, drawn carefully and specifically the way Lily drew everything she wanted to remember. In the corner of the drawing, so small you had to look for it, Lily had written, "The coin in the parking lot." Clara had not told Lily that phrase. Her mother had said it by the fire, and Lily had been upstairs. But Lily had heard it through the old floors, the way sound traveled in houses that had been there a long time, and she had written it down and made it part of the record, the way she made everything she believed should be remembered part of the record. That was her gift. Not just the drawing or the sketchbook or the amber eyes that missed nothing. The understanding, at 8 years old, that memory was something you made deliberately, that the things worth keeping required someone to keep them. Clara thought about Harlan Greer's letter, about the sealed wax and the chamois leather and the survey portfolio at the bottom of the last box, about a man who had understood the same thing and had spent 40 years acting on it. She thought about the farmhouse, standing through 60 years of no one because it had been built to stand regardless of whether anyone was watching. She thought about $300, about the auctioneer's flat voice and the empty hands and the key on the rusted ring and the cold dry air that came up from the vault when she lifted the lid, the smell of things kept in the dark for longer than she had been alive. She thought about Lily's dream, the white light from beneath the cellar door. There were things you could explain about how it had happened, the logic of it, the chain of events from the bulletin board to the auction to rural Route 7 to the cellar steps to the brass key. You could lay that chain out clearly and it would make sense, cause and effect, choice following choice, each one reasonable in its own terms. But underneath the chain of causes was something that didn't fit inside cause and effect. The feeling, from the first moment, that this had been waiting, that the house had held its secret not merely through inertia or neglect, but with intent, the specific patient intent of something that understood the right person would come. Maybe that was just the story the mind made of random events, the narrative it imposed on coincidence to make coincidence bearable. Or maybe Harlan Greer had understood something, 40 years of careful preservation, that she was only now beginning to understand. That the things worth keeping had a way of keeping themselves, if you gave them the conditions. If you built them right and sealed them carefully and wrote the letter and left the key in a place where the right person would eventually find it. She had been the right person. Not because she was exceptional, because she had shown up. There was something else that stayed with her, something she turned over in the quiet evenings when the house was still and Lily was asleep and the fire was coaling down. The auction room. The 11 other bidders who had not raised their hands. She had thought about them sometimes in the hard weeks in the car, wondering what they had seen in the listing that she had failed to see, what competence they possessed in reading the language of county tax auctions that had told them this particular property was not worth their time or their $200. She understood now that they had read it correctly. By every reasonable measure, by every prior piece of evidence the listing provided, the property on rural Route 7 was not worth $200. Certainly not worth the time of men with canvas jackets and established interests who knew which properties paid off and which didn't, and had learned to trust that knowledge over the instinct that sometimes pulled you toward the thing everyone else had dismissed. They had been rational, and she had been desperate. Desperation had looked, from the outside, exactly like foolishness. They had been indistinguishable, in the auction room, in Dana's voice on the phone, in her mother's careful warning. And they were indistinguishable from the outside because the only thing that separated them was the outcome, and the outcome wasn't visible yet. She had not known the vault was there. She had not known about Harlan Greer's letter or the brass key or the 1874 survey portfolio. She had known only that she had $300 and that the alternative to spending them was a certainty she couldn't accept. That was the whole of it. Not courage, exactly. Necessity that looked like courage from the outside and felt, from the inside, like being left with no other move. She thought about all the people living in cars and on couches and in shelters right now. People whose only available moves looked foolish from the outside and felt like survival from the inside. She thought about what it meant that the thing that had saved her had been invisible from outside her own desperation. She thought about that, and she did not try to resolve it into a lesson, because some things resisted the shape of lessons. She thought, I got lucky. And then, I also showed up. Both things were true, and neither one canceled the other out. Roy was talking about the county's mining history, about the corridor that the Montrose case had centered on, about the communities that had risen and fallen around it in the 1870s and 1880s. Her mother was asking questions with the focused interest she brought to history, the way she had always brought to history, the version of herself that existed before the careful fear. Lily was listening and drawing at the same time, her pencil moving across a new page in the sketchbook. Clara looked around the table, at these specific people in this specific room, at the fire, at the drawing on the wall. She looked at Roy, who had driven 14 miles in the dark with a cardboard box of groceries because he had seen a woman and a child in a situation he recognized and had decided, without ceremony, to be useful. He had not asked what he would get from it. He had not calculated the return. He had simply shown up, in the particular way that some people showed up, quietly and with materials in hand. And she understood that this quality in him was the same quality that had driven Harlan Greer's 40 years of careful work, the same quality that had led Margaret Mitchell to build upward when she had no room to build outward in the inspiration story that Clara had never actually read but had been living a version of without knowing it. The world was full of people like Roy Buell. She had not always been able to see them, in the years when fear had narrowed her vision to the space directly in front of her next problem. Now she could see them, because she was no longer in the posture of someone who could only receive help, but in the posture of someone who could also give it, and that posture changed what was visible. She thought about what she would do with what she had, not in the abstract, not in the large terms of a foundation mandate or a preservation mission, but in the specific terms of next Tuesday, next month, next year. She would pay attention. She would show up. She would look at the thing everyone else had walked past and ask whether it had been looked at carefully. It was not a complicated philosophy. Harlan Greer had built an entire life on it, 40 years of showing up and paying attention, and it had produced a vault full of things that no one else had understood the value of. She had found the vault by doing the same thing, in the only version available to her, stopping at a bulletin board in a laundromat at 7:45 on a Wednesday morning when she was 11 days into sleeping in her car, reading a notice printed on bright orange paper, and raising her hand. That was all it had been, stopping when it would have been easier to keep walking. She was still afraid, in the particular way that didn't go away when you had money, that resolved some fears only to clarify others, that showed you the new version of what there was to lose when the old version had been removed. She was afraid of what she owed to a discovery this large, afraid of whether she was the person equal to it, afraid of the ways that money changed things that she did not want changed. But the fear was different now. It was fear in a house you owned, by a fire you had built, with the debt paid, and the child fed and the key in your pocket. That was a different kind of fear entirely. She would spend the coming months making decisions that she was not yet qualified to make and learning the qualification by making them. She would establish a foundation named for Harlan Greer, funded by a portion of the settlement, devoted to the preservation of rural properties, whose histories were at risk of being lost. She would work with the county historical board and with a small team of researchers to document the mining era that Harlan had spent his life collecting the remnants of, building an archive that Roy would eventually house in the building that had once been a bank and now sold antiques, and would one day become a different kind of institution. The foundation would employ 3 people by the end of its first year. A researcher and archivist named Tom Calloway, no relation to Margaret, who had spent 15 years at a university library and had reached the point where he needed the work to mean something direct and particular rather than institutional and general. A property assessor named Vera Singh who had grown up in a county much like this one and who understood from personal history what it meant for old places to lose their documentation before anyone had thought to care. And Pat Granger's nephew, who turned out to have a background in digital preservation and who built the archive's catalog system in the first 6 months with a quiet thoroughness that reminded Clara of Lily at her most focused. She would hire people and make mistakes and learn from them and build something that her project manager's mind found satisfying in its logistics, and that her other mind, the one that had stood in the cold cellar with the flashlight and the brass key, found necessary in a way that went past satisfaction. The old farmhouse on rural Route 7 was listed on the National Historic Register 12 months after Clara's arrival, recognized for its connection to the mining era, for the collection that Harlan Greer had assembled within its walls, and for the survey documents that had resolved a 63-year legal question about the land beneath the county. The listing came with a modest federal preservation grant that Clara used to restore the barn, which she had been wanting to do since the first week, when Lily had started drawing it, and kept capturing the dignified stubbornness of the one standing and refusing to follow the other. The barn took 3 months to restore properly, Roy sourcing the materials and overseeing the work with the steady care of someone investing in something they expected to outlast them. When it was done, it looked like what it was, a barn that had been through a great deal and had been worth saving. Lily drew it again in its restored state and hung both drawings side by side, before and after, with a caption that read, "Same barn, different chapter." Lily would grow up in this house. She would go to the county school and make the friends she had assessed correctly on the first week and eventually several others. And she would draw every room of the farmhouse and every corner of the fields and every face of every coin from the vault before they went to their respective auction houses, creating a record of the collection in her own hand that Margaret Calloway would later describe as one of the most thorough visual inventories she had ever encountered from a non-professional source. She would get the dog, a livestock guardian breed recommended by one of the co-op farmers as appropriate for the land, who would turn out to be exactly the right animal for the kind of child who needed a creature of complete loyalty and substantial intelligence to match her own. And the farmhouse would stand, as it had stood before them, as it would stand after, answering the question that old buildings answered when they were built right and kept by people who understood what they were for. Not, "What is this worth?" but "Who needs this?" Clara would think about Harlan Greer for the rest of her life. She would never know everything about him, would piece together from the documents and the photographs and the local records a portrait that was detailed in some respects and opaque in others, the way all portraits of the dead were opaque, where the living memory had run out. She would know that he had been a careful man and a solitary one, and that his solitude had not been emptiness but occupation, 40 years of purposeful work that nobody had understood from the outside. She would know that he had trusted the house to hold the secret, and the house had. She would know that he had trusted the right person to come. She looked across the table at Lily, who had stopped drawing and was listening to Roy talk about the 1874 mine survey, with the focused attention she brought to things she intended to remember. The coin in the parking lot. You had to be walking in the right direction. You had to be paying attention. You had to be the kind of person who, when everyone else kept moving, stopped. Clara had stopped. That was all it had been. $300 and stopping. The snow fell outside and the fire moved in the grate and the table was full and the house held them inside its old, patient walls, and somewhere below the kitchen floor, in the stone-step cellar, the vault sat empty for the first time in 63 years, its lid standing open, nothing to guard anymore, its work done. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.